So let me welcome all the guests. This is our second day of conference, as all of you know. Welcome to this virtual environment created by Sapienza University for the sake of the conference. We had yesterday, as all you know, 2 keynote lectures concerning Alexander von Humboldt by Franco Farinelli, and one on Ernst Haeckel by Rainer William, and a rich discussion followed, reasoning on these two personalities, on their capacity of keeping together the scientific, the humanistic, and the artistic approach, and an holistic view. Today, we will evaluate their legacy, the relevance of their thoughts, especially in the educational field, of landscape design and planning. So we have invited few major schools around the world involved in landscape design education, and especially the École Nationale Supérieure de Paysage of Versailles, Harvard University in Cambridge, University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, University of Virginia in Charlottesville, University of Edinburgh, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. I say it in English, German is difficult for me, better known as the ATH in Zurich. Distinguished professors from all these universities will discuss issues concerning landscape education in the past and in the present time. Yves Petit-Berghem, unfortunately, had to give up for health reasons, and we wish him a quick recovery. He wanted to discuss how landscape design is based in the use of data from the natural sciences and in the integration of the actions of human societies in the teaching method in Versailles. And we will, of course, hopefully collect his text for the publication. We have Anita Berizbetia and Pablo Perez Ramos that work together on the paper that they are presenting. It's presenting only Pablo today because Anita has another commitment. She was with us yesterday. They will trace the history of pedagogy in Harvard and how much ecology is part of the academic and professional contexts. Another historical insight will be given by landscape historian Sonia Dampelman, who will discuss the unified vision of nature and culture in the Humboldtian Park in Berlin, conceived as an educational objective in the Prussia between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Michael Lee will instead examine how contemporary landscape architectural education has largely abandoned the composition and its aesthetic foundations as a central assumption of studio culture, to embrace instead the more administrative procedures. Francisca Lima will concentrate on how landscape theory teaching can impact design, making, and field work. And finally, Gunther Vogt will speak of the methodological framework of his design teaching known as process cartography. Fabio Di Carlo and Rita Biasi, both of them part of our PhD program, will give a brief report on landscape schools in Italy and in Rome, and will animate the discussion with our guests, starting from the central concept of our conference, the landscape as union of art and science. So I'm sincerely grateful to all of you for being with us. Happy to establish some links, and I'm honored to host you here. and although in a virtual mode. So let's hope in a future meeting with a nice dinner and physical exchanges. So I give the floor to Pablo Perez Ramos, since if Petit is not here. Pablo is assistant professor of landscape architecture at Harvard Graduate School of Design. He holds a Doctor of Design and a Master in Landscape Architecture degree from GSD, and is licensed architect from the Escuela Técnica Superior de Arquitectura de Madrid. Perez Ramos investigates the origins of contemporary ecological views in landscape architecture through an examination of the central debates in ecological theory. He's currently working on a thermodynamic theory of landscape architecture, which focuses on the interference that exists between design and the other forces through which the environment is formed. So we thank him very much, and we thank also Anita Beitia, who is a professor of landscape architecture and chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture in Harvard, that could not be with us today, but they both worked on this lecture, on this paper. So thank you very much, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. Everybody hears me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me do a little bit of screen engineering here. Make sure that this shows what it should be showing. Okay. Okay, you see a white screen with a few letters inside, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much again, Alessandra, for this very nice introduction. I'm looking forward to the day of today. And thank you very much for the organization, Veronica, Liliana, Thania, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. As Alessandra mentioned, this presentation was originally intended to be done in tandem with Anita Beitia, the chair of the department. But it is the open house this morning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and she needed to be there. She sends her regards, and she also asked me to let Professor Rainer Wilhelm, I'm not sure if he's here, I think I saw him, that she really enjoyed his presentation as much as she did with Franco Farinelli's, and as much as I did myself yesterday. Our presentation is called, as you see in the screen, Cumulative Influences, Ecological Science, Practice, and Discourse in the Education of a Landscape Architect. And I'm going to start. So in as much as ecology, the slide flipped, right? We're good. Okay. In as much as ecology has evolved over the past 200 years, so has its relationship to landscape architecture in both the academic and the professional contexts. In the United States, landscape architecture emerges during the late 19th century, almost concurrently with Ernst Haeckel's coining of the term ecology. And like ecology itself, it has had its own evolution, disciplinary core, and expansive margins in which the influence of ecological ideas waxes and wanes, but is very strongly felt, especially since the beginning of the environmental movement, the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, and the rise of environmental planning as a major field within landscape architecture. Since then, ecological concepts and positions have had a major role in changing and advancing the discipline of landscape architecture. In this paper, we will briefly review 4 major paradigms that are still operative in the pedagogy and practice of landscape architecture, and we'll argue that the different paradigms are necessarily utilized in a synchronous way as they each engage specific scales and forms of knowledge, as well as different analytical and evaluative frameworks, offering a complete set of tools for action-oriented research and design. So the first of this is the equilibrium model. what we called equilibrium ecology. Okay. During the first half of the 20th century, plant ecology in America was dominated by the holistic thinking of the botanist Frederick Clemens. In his landmark volume, Plant Succession of 1916, Clemens described natural vegetation as organized in discrete and uniform cognitive units, which he called plant formations or plant associations, and which were the result of physiographic and climatic conditions. The causal relationship of patterns of vegetation with larger abiotic factors and the use of the world association itself denote an influence of Humboldt, who described his own project, quote, the science that concerns itself with plants as in their local association in the various climates. So Humboldt sought to explain how, even though the Earth's rocky crust had been formed by the same set of geological processes throughout, the life forms that covered the crust changed dramatically depending on local conditions. So Clemens proposed that plant associations exist in balance with environmental conditions. In the event of a disturbance, they would be affected and might even disappear, only to spontaneously begin to recover once the disturbance has ceased their original aspect and functional characteristics. This process of evolution towards a consistent plant association over a certain region is called succession, and the equilibrium state these associations eventually achieve is the climax formation. So what we have here in this diagram is, of course, time is flowing from the bottom to the top, and we see that it doesn't matter which route we follow, we always end up at this climax forest condition. So almost concurrently with the early development of the organismic model, a more reductionist and stochastic conception of plant behavior was formulated by Henry Gleason. Through simple observation, Gleason argued, it became clear that the vegetation growing on a given area was just the result of the fluctuating behavior of individual plants responding to the equally fluctuating environmental conditions. In his mind, Clemens' plant associations were mere metaphoric constructions. Their boundaries were arbitrarily drawn on the basis of the predominance of certain dominant species. They could be certainly helpful for establishing some typological landscape categorizations, but they should always be acknowledged as arbitrary, subjective, and simplifying. And these two different diagrams trying to express in a way these different plant communities happening along a given environmental gradient with a high degree of coordination and sharp boundaries in the Clemens model, and something much more stochastic and spontaneous in the case of Gleason's model at the bottom. So Gleason also criticized Clemens' idea of succession. Gleason suggested that the development of plants in an area is subject to a multitude of contingencies, most of which lie beyond the plant organism itself, including the random dispersal of seeds by external means or the presence of a competitor species in the area of seeding. The final composition of the vegetation growing on the land would be merely the result of chaotic processes. Small variations in the conditions of departure and slight changes during the development of successional processes could result in radically different outcomes. That is a non-deterministic view of succession. So this mid-20th century dispute between these two antagonistic models was eventually resolved in favor of Clemens with the rise of an equilibrium-based ecosystems ecology, which became the field's fundamental paradigm in the US during the 1960s and 70s, and whose fundamental proponents, the Odum brothers, Eugene and Howard, were a source of inspiration for Ian McHarg's environmental planning project. The tension between holism and reductionism, between the homeostatic and the stochastic visions of ecology was revived, however, again during the last few decades, as a new complex systems approach came to challenge ecosystems ecology. The complex systems model accepts, as much as Clemens and Odum did, the existence of certain tendencies in the natural environment, such as natural associations and plant succession, but only as long phases of gradual growth that get eventually interrupted by some form of disturbance that brings the adaptive cycle back to the point of departure. From there, the new successional process might unfold in new and predictable directions. So rather than offering a new model that superseded and fully rejected previous images of the environment, this complex systems ecology came to internalize and to integrate equilibrium concepts such as the plant association and the notion of succession with known equilibrium ideas of disturbance. What we see here on the left would be an incipient stage in the successional process, maybe the result of a pest or a fire, and time would be flowing into these more mature plant associations on the right. This is the Blue Ridge Mountains in the northeast of the US. So while Clemens and Gleason were observing successional landscapes with no recent human input in the American Midwest, in the 1980s, Richard Foreman began to develop diagrams and models that were eventually going to be fundamental theory for the subdiscipline of landscape ecology. And Foreman did so by looking at the heavily anthropized landscapes of the US Northeast, and with an emphasis in the spatial expression of ecological ideas. Foreman departed from the gestaltic premise that when seen from above, the spatial heterogeneity of these anthropic landscapes is of a kind that might be described as a mosaic, a two-dimensional pattern composed of different elements that abut the adjacent ones with rather distinct boundaries. Landscape ecology's language of patches, corridors, mosaics, edges, and so on, aimed at the mediation between the spatial configuration of the landscape and the ecological processes that take place on it. It must be noted that these landscapes, again, exhibit a much greater degree of spatial heterogeneity than those of Clemens and Gleason, precisely because they receive much greater inputs of human management. These are productive landscapes of agriculture, suburban development, mobility, communication, and remnant forests. So these four models that I just explained, when applied individually, cannot address all of the decision-making that is necessary in the design of landscapes. Here we define landscapes, as settings, natural settings, if you like, at least at some point, that are intervened for the benefit of a society. These interventions involve the management of natural cycles and dynamics such that time is accelerated and slowed down, depending on what the intention is or what that landscape is supposed to be. And we might think of large conservation areas such as national parks versus an urban park versus a garden, etc. So the equilibrium model in particular of ecology that we just mentioned comes to remind us that there exist certain tendencies in the environment which unfold indifferently to us, and then there exist forms and orders that result from greater scales of space and time than those that landscape architecture normally engages. Ideas of equilibrium remain nevertheless operative in landscape architecture. At large scales of design where human energy inputs per area unit are low, think of labor and budget required for maintenance, design strategies need to rely on other sources of energy, such as climate, topography, soil conditions, and so on. And design strategies need to assume the organization and processes, including disturbances, that result from those non-human sources of energy. Landscape architects operating within this model, curate such natural tendencies by accelerating or slowing them down and contribute to the stabilization of their desired outcomes. However, at the other end of the scale spectrum, This model provides a solid framework for developing planting palettes that designers use in the very granular decision processes at the site scale. While at this smaller scales, While at this smaller scale, designs can be more experimental and propose planting palettes that do not just happen naturally. Equilibrium models of ecology provide with the specific forms of life that tend to thrive in such or such environmental conditions, so that the maintenance required in the design intervention must not be invested in the very survival of the introduced life forms, but in something else. At the GSD, these ideas are central to our Ecologies, Techniques, Technologies class, and have been so since this course was reintroduced in 1982, almost 2 centuries after Humboldt's, by Michael van Valkenburg, and by a seminal text, Neil Jorgensen's A Sierra Club Naturalist Guide to Southern New England. Another important application of this equilibrium model is the transect, which is used profusely in landscape architecture education and practice today. As with Humboldt's chief drawing of the Chimborazo, design transects act synecdochally. They aim at revealing in a straightforwardly manner the richness and the complexity of conditions that precede and follow the design intervention, regardless of the nature of these conditions, whether they are ecological, social, economic, or simply spatial. In the context of climate change and storm events, they are especially useful in the design of land-water interfaces for adaptability and resilience. As a sectional idea, the transect is a bridge concept that explains the distribution of species and landscape types with the known equilibrium adaptive model of design. Transects also act typologically in that they explain types of transitions between different ecosystems, usually expressed as gradients of change, rather than spatially bounded types. Both the transect and the gradient serve as useful models to think about distribution of non-natural spaces, such as programs and infrastructure. In as much as this equilibrium model affords broad applications, it also has its limitations. For by taking this model too seriously, we run the risk of arriving at the conclusion that nature always does better. Any design effort might be directed towards the preservation of an idealized and predictable understanding of nature. The reductionist stochastic model of ecology offers an alternative vision freed from this restriction. It reminds us that chance and contingency often play an important role in successional processes, and that not every inch of the face of the earth might be classifiable in accordance within a fixed ecological categorization. However, the image of nature as in constant flux has been also co-opted, sometimes unconsciously, as the ultimate aestheticization of politics, where one can sit back, relax, and let the automated process of self-organizing labor do it for us, as Timothy Morton would say. The individualistic, opportunistic, and unpredictable behavior of the non-equilibrium model of ecology has come to legitimize, to naturalize neoliberal positions in the design fields. Any form of political, governmental, or managerial action is rendered futile in favor of open-ended processes of adaptation. As a result, the political agency of design is restrained, with the specification of design outcomes handed over to the indeterminate and abstract forces of capitalism. Despite the central value of the concept of succession in the equilibrium model, it is this non-equilibrium ecology, the one that is more often associated with processual logics in design, as a primarily management model that privileges the anything goes vision of landscape. However, it neither accounts for the need and desire to introduce plants and or vegetation systems that could respond to particular or specific mandates, such as climate mitigation or other particular functionalities. nor does it account for spatial frameworks that are necessary, especially when social programs are introduced in landscape. Landscape ecology thus offers landscape architecture with a robust conceptual framework to understand the spatial and scalar expression of ecological processes. Landscape ecology's focus on anthropic landscapes allows to introduce formal configurations to landscape architecture that are not based on the humanistic versus naturalistic design binary mode of thinking. Furthermore, the mediation between the spatial configuration of the landscape and the ecological processes that take place on it connects landscape with form, with ecological function, and thus established a direct parallel to design thinking. These spatial frameworks help our students understand formal logics, that is, the causal relationships that exist between the forms that landscape architecture introduces on the land and the processes by which they come to be or with which might make them disappear. However, even though it opens the door to formal exploration, it still requires the input of the previous ecological models to result in a complete conceptualization of landscape. And in as much as landscape ecology has provided landscape architecture with spatial frameworks, so has the complex systems model of ecology offered a productive way of engaging the temporal dimension of landscape. While earlier phases in the maturation of ecology were characterized by mutually exclusive paradigms, it is possible again to read in the complex systems approach the internalization of previous paradigms and the reconciliation of their apparently opposing views. In the positivist project of a unified science, one paradigm often comes to replace another, which is in turn quickly forgotten. But this mode of thinking is problematic for design. For design is based on a situation-specific understanding of needs and meaning that can only be explained interpretatively. So in conclusion, landscape architecture today is a very broad discipline, and its practice is highly contextual, by which we mean that it's contingent on externalities rarely present in ecological models. With this, while these contribute to frameworks for navigating the challenges of working with living material, with grappling with expectations of permanence in spite of predictions of great, sudden, and unpredictable change, and give designers tools to evaluate ecological content in formal and spatial configurations, neither of these models by themselves provide robust enough frameworks for design. Again, in part, this is because modern science advances in a linear way, with advances superseding previous models that then become obsolete. By contrast, landscape architecture and the spatial design practices in general are disciplines that accumulate rather than replace knowledge on the one hand, and are more open to shifting conceptual models depending on the nature of the project itself. In other words, the design process transcends the 4 different models of ecology presented here today by flowing across them, coordinating them in relationship to one another spatially and programmatically, and overlaying them. This is especially relevant today as landscape architecture demands a multi-pronged approach to addressing the complexity of issues we face at the intersection of environmental decay and social injustice. We have gone from rigid models to cumulative concepts. It is precisely in the interpretation, the juxtaposition, and even the transgression of these scientific ideas that the art of landscape architecture resides. In this interdisciplinarity that allows us to see design principles in natural models and vice versa, where a closed scientific mind might only see aberration and failure, others see opportunity and potential. And thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Pablo Perez Ramos, for this interesting introduction and difficult in some passages, but very, very interesting because of this view on the current landscape as interpretation of space and broad contextual inclusion of these 4 different models of ecology that you have explained at the beginning of your lecture. So I pass the floor to Sonja Dumpelmann, that will give a lecture that is entitled Humboldtian in Berlin, Landscape Architecture in the Geographical Imagination and Education in Prussia. Sonja Dumpelmann is a landscape historian and associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania Weizmann School of Design. She's the author and editor of several books, most recently the prize-winning Seeing Trees, A History of Street Trees in New York City and Berlin, Yale University Press, 2019. She lectures internationally and has served as president of the Landscape History chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians and a senior fellow in the Garden and Landscape Studies at the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection, Washington, D.C. She's a 2021 fellow at the Berlin Institute for Advanced Studies. Thank you, Sonja, for being with us, and please take the floor.
Molte grazie Alessandra e molte grazie a tutti gli organizzatori di questo convegno. Mi fa molto piacere di essere qui con voi. E allora I'll switch to English and share my screen, and hopefully you can see that right now. Is that okay? The usual question, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm actually also going to take us back in time. I'm not going to speak about current education in landscape architecture, but I'm happy to do so maybe later in the discussion. But I will be speaking about all the aspects of this panel, namely landscape architecture, education, and von Humboldt. So many of you will be familiar with Paolo Bergi's 1990s landscape architecture on top of Cardada Mountain near Locarno in Ticino, the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, with Michael van Valkenburg Associates Teardrop Park in downtown Manhattan that opened in 2006, and with Günther Vogt's Novartis campus concluded in Basel in 2016. As diverse as these park landscapes and their settings, as well as their political, social, and cultural contexts are, they share a preoccupation with deep time. All 3 parks, in one way or another, relate to their landscape context by way of the immediate and constructed site's geology and geomorphology. Although the meanings, messages, and pleasures the parks provide and portray are multiple and various, and although they can, of course, not be called to educational intent alone, the designs quite literally unearth parts of the site's natural histories for visitors to experience and see, or even engage with in a more cognizant way. This method of practice, and in fact, the nature of the resulting designs, is, as I would like to argue here, characteristic of not only some of the finest, most recent park designs, but of some of the most celebrated and interesting 19th century public urban parks as well. And I'm realizing that my screen doesn't want to move forward for some reason. Let me see.
Exit and re-enter.
Yeah, seems to be, oops, there you go. Okay, sorry about that. So here's the Parc de Buttes-Chaumont and Central Park. So some early park designers were quite explicit about the educational intent of the botanical, zoological, and geological collections or formations they were integrating into their parks. And it is in these cases that connections between park designs and Alexander von Humboldt's work and legacy become the most overt and can perhaps be discerned most clearly. So in the following, I will use landscape gardener Gustav Meyer's design for Berlin's Humboldt-Hain, which you see here, a public park opened in 1872, as the focus of a larger discussion of the relationship between landscape architecture, geography, and public education during the German Empire. I will show that within the aesthetic conventions of the time, Meyer and the designers who followed him turned the park into a microcosm of Humboldt's cosmos. But as much as the park was an expression of both empiricism and romanticism, and of the unified vision of nature and culture as exemplified by Humboldt, it soon also naturalized the colonial sentiment that was growing in Prussia in the years between 1880 and the First World War. The design, its educational aspirations, and colonial entanglements both resulted from and supported the state's educational objectives that increasingly sought to normalize and naturalize the empire's colonial endeavors and territorial claims. The park thus became a hybrid expression of both nativism and colonialism. If it had initially been designed to honor and celebrate Humboldt's cosmopolitan worldview, it soon became implicated in forging the German Empire's nationalist and colonial prowess. In the first decades of its existence, Humboldt-Hain was, I would like to argue, turned into an educational experience of empire. Now, Berlin's Humboldt-Hain, literally translated into English Humboldt Grove, is not the only public urban park carrying the famous geographer's name. There is also Humboldt Park in Chicago, for example, which was first designed in 1871. However, Humboldt-Hain is the only park named after Humboldt in his native Berlin. In the 1860s, city authorities decided to dedicate to the polymath the already projected North Park, which we see right here, and to turn it into a space that could serve both recreational and educational needs. Its site on 35 hectares north of the city center in Berlin-Wedding, a former working class district, was the location of the biggest German celebration of the 100th anniversary of the polymath's birth in 1869. City garden director Gustav Meyer's park design was part of a much larger reform movement regarding not only public health, but also public, that means workers' education, which included the implementation of mandatory mass education for boys and girls between 6 and 14 years of age. Humboldt himself had held his Cosmos lectures in the 1820s in front of a general public. Since the 1830s, the first educational workers' associations had been founded in Prussia, and in Berlin in 1850, 4 so-called Volksbibliotheken opened following the first free public libraries established in North America. In the second half of the 19th century, Humboldt's work, his renown, popularization, and cult status inspired an upswing in the natural sciences. Humboldt societies were founded and celebrations in Humboldt's name sought to popularize the natural sciences and advocate for nature protection, especially after the scientist's death in 1859. In 1888, the scientific society Urania was founded in Berlin to communicate the most scientific findings to the most recent scientific findings to the public. During this time, the German public also increasingly engaged with ideas of a colonial expansion. For example, since the middle of the 19th century, middle-class readers had a number of journals at their disposal covering contemporary European exploration and conquest. After his death in 1859, Humboldt also became a figurehead in efforts to build community and forge national identity. However, the scientist's manifold, cosmopolitan, cross-disciplinary interests, his criticism of slavery, and his sympathy for the 1848 revolution, and particularly his affinities with France and the Americas, also made it difficult to render him as a national figure. This contributed to thwarting all attempts of the so-called Committee for the Erection of a National Humboldt Memorial that had formed for this purpose in 1869. As I will show, the evolving park design embodied these tensions surrounding the scientist. Meyer's 1870 design for the park that was carried out after the 1869 celebrations had a clear educational intent that was strengthened further through the addition of several elements in the course of the following decades under Meyer's successor, garden director Hermann Mächtig. Besides including a lawn playground, I'm pointing out here, for physical education and ball games, I'm not going to elaborate on this. I've written about this elsewhere. Humboldt-Hain became an outdoor classroom for the education of the natural sciences for the general public. Besides nature's aesthetic appreciation, thought to enhance morals, its analytical study now received increasing attention in public education. Meyer's design was based upon Humboldt's idea of plant geography, a concept that had also shaped Meyer's woody plants lists in his 1860 textbook on garden art. The park's plantings corresponded to various climate zones in Europe, Asia, and North America. The three continental zones were further subdivided into areas for plants representing the Arctic, subarctic, subtropical, and warm and cold temperate zones. Nevertheless, as one contemporary commentator remarked, the plantings were effortlessly combined. By 1902, 773 different woody plant species, including some from South America and Africa, had turned the park into a ground that came close to an arboretum. Each tree specimen was accompanied with green sheet iron identification plates with the Latin and German name, geographical origin, and climate zone. With increasing age, many of the fast-growing trees planted for instant greening were thinned, thus producing Meyer's aspired naturalistic aesthetic with woody plants from different climate zones and realizing his intent to merge scientific purpose with aesthetic effect. Urban growth diminished spontaneous plant growth in the city and led to the establishment of parks like Humboldt-Hain, making plant supply gardens for urban schools both necessary and possible in the first place. So in 1875, Humboldt-Hain actually became the central plant supply garden for Berlin's schools, delivering to 6 schools in that first year and to 42 in the following. During its first decades, a steadily increasing number of educational institutions were provided with fresh plant materials grown by the city gardeners at Humboldt-Hain. And in 80 planting beds along the southern edge of the park, at the bottom here, and in additional ones in the north, as you see in this kind of red triangle on the top there, Humboldt-Hain's gardeners delivered around 1,200 different native and non-native plant species, 3 to 4 of which were delivered to schools twice a week. Several greenhouses were built for the purpose in the 1880s and 90s, and in the first decades of the 20th century, Humboldt-Hain was delivering between 2.5 and 3 million plant specimens, I should say, to Berlin schools every year. The establishment of Humboldt-Hain as central school supply garden followed the 1872 Prussian school inspection law, decreed to secularize education, promote the natural sciences, and to encourage a methodological paradigm shift in children's education towards empiricism, object lessons, and field study. The law determined that, quote, in geography and natural history, object lessons should form the basis. These could be provided in geography by the globe and map, in nature description by the real objects and good illustrations, and in nature studies by experiments. The study and description of plants in particular played an important role in children's education during the German Empire. It was considered ideal for their emotional and cognitive development, given that it involved all the senses and that plants also offered themselves to exercises in analytical classification. If space was available, schools established their own gardens where ideally pupils would also be taught to garden. The school garden movement was not only promoted by reform-minded teachers, garden inspectors, and landscape gardeners like Axel Fintelmann, who directed Humboldt-Heinz Supply Garden and who actually then also drew up a prototypical school garden plan, as you see here, but physicians saw in gardening a light, fresh air exercise that benefited and bolstered children's health. In 1888, Humboldt-Heinz plant collection was complemented with an open-air vivarium replete with chalk stones forming an alpinum that provided an artificial habitat for reptiles and amphibians. The vivarium was the biggest of its kind in the German Empire and meant to make the public familiar with a part of the animal kingdom often provoking fear. Finally, in the years 1894 and 95, the 25-meter-long geological wall was added to the park. At the time, educators were suggesting the establishment of rocky outcrops or rock sections consisting of local stones and minerals in school gardens. Of course, Berlin had to receive its fair due. It had become the German scientific center of geology at the beginning of the century when the Prussian Mining Academy was associated with the newly founded Friedrich Wilhelms University. Humboldt-Heinz geological wall could finally bring the science to the general public. Contrary to schools and museums' rock collections, it connected dispersed objects and made apparent the relationships between the individual rocks and the laws determining their formation and layering. The wall followed a proposal of City Councilman Ernst Friedel, founder and first director of Märkisches Museum, the local history museum. Friedel's interests lay in both local history as well as Prussia's colonial expansion. So Berlin schoolmaster Eduard Sache was charged with creating the wall for school instruction and public education. Mines and quarries along the German Empire delivered 124 different rocks that were then assembled to create a chronological transect through the Earth's crust. The great efforts were undertaken to merge the wall. With the surrounding park landscapes so that it would appear like a quarry or a cut through the Earth's crust when seen from a distance. To support this illusion, the landscape behind the wall was shaped and planted to suggest distant mountain ranges. At least that's what people were saying at the time, even if we don't necessarily see that in this photograph. Similar to the cosmopolitan plant collection that furnished parts of the park's initial design material, the geological wall therefore became an integral part of Humboldt-Heinz design. And like the park's plants, it paid homage to the explorer's interests that he had begun to cultivate and hone during his foundational studies at the Mining Academy in Freiberg, Saxony in the early 1790s. Humboldt's interest in geology stood at the core of much of his work. He was a co-founder of the German Geological Society in 1848 and lectured on the geological formation of the Earth's crust, an aspect that was then also published posthumously in the 5th volume of Cosmos in 1862. Walking along the wall from right to left, visitors followed a chronological transect from primitive times to the various phases of the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, and the Neolithic periods. Similar to the plants distributed throughout the park according to geography and climate zones, the geological wall offered a kinetic experience of the study objects, a kinetic form of guided learned experience. It was a tamed, domesticated version of scientific discovery that did not require the hardships and perils of contemporary travel. In other words, it enabled school children and the public to become Humboldt for some hours. Like the revered scientist whose comparative method was closely tied to his own spatial movement when he traveled, they could compare and subjectively experience plants from different climate zones and continents, as well as rocks from across the German Empire during a walk in the park. In addition to horizontal travel in space, the geological wall offered vertical time travel. That means a walk into deep time. Humboldt became a microcosm in which time and space were compressed, and the subjective experience and objectifying study of nature were intimately connected. As Zache explained, the geological wall could offer a foundational educational experience. He posited that the aesthetic pleasure and historic and geographical knowledge of landscapes gleaned by increasing numbers of citizens when fleeing the growing cities during summer vacations was incomplete without knowledge of the underlying ground. After all, it was the ground, its soils, rocks, and minerals that shaped landscapes. In a geologically determinist bent, Zache argued that rocks ruled culture. He lobbied for both geology and geography's cultural relevance. Zache's argument echoed geographer Karl Ritter's early 19th century geographical paradigm of the interrelationship between geography and history, meaning that the land affected humans and humans affected the land. It also mirrored Humboldt's understanding of the complex dialectic of space or geography and history. The geological wall revealed geography's late 19th century turn towards the natural sciences on the one hand, and on the other, its efforts to become independent of both history and the natural sciences altogether by embracing geology and geomorphology and by presenting itself as a spatial science. In 1895, geographer and teacher Heinrich Harms, for example, demanded that geology be included in curricula for elementary and lower secondary education. Many instructors agreed that in higher grades, instruction should also include the historical geology of the respective school's region, given its vital practical importance for agriculture, water supply, and the supply with stone for construction. Although Humboldt-Heinz' geological wall did not concentrate on specimens from a particular region, as the vivarium did, it did confine itself to portraying the geology within German borders, thus representing a shared geological history for the German Empire founded in 1871. In contrast to the plants from different continents and climate zones, the wall offered an object lesson confined to the lands of the young German nation. The wall taught onlookers to read the deep time roots of their landscapes, and it connected them to their homeland by establishing its petrified prehistoric origins. This patriotic focus went hand in hand with geography's increasing politicization after the empire's foundation. Geographers realized that they could legitimize and strengthen their field by contributing to nation building. Darwin's contentious 1859 theory of evolution and Ernst Haeckel's 1860s theory of recapitulation, meaning that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, had initially led to the reduction of school lessons in the natural sciences to limit exposure to these hypotheses that disturbed religious beliefs. However, by the 1890s, it had become clear that in what now was seen by many as a social Darwinist struggle for global expansion and national wealth, the natural sciences and the spatial science geography could come in handy. At the beginning of the 20th century, geography professor Friedrich Ratzel popularized the Lebensraum concept, comprising policies and practices of settler colonialism that proliferated in Germany between 1890 and the 1940s. The motto of the Association of School Geographers, founded in 1911, declared with imperial hubris, "Knowledge is power, geographical knowledge is global power." In this political climate, Humboldt-Heinz plants grown according to geographical zones and provided for schools' botanical study, its vivarium and geological wall contributed to an education that was increasingly utilitarian and subject to colonial and expansionist interests. Already in 1872, the Prussian school inspection law demanded that elementary and lower secondary school curricula include nature description of native rocks, plants, and animals, as well as of the big foreign predators, the fauna and flora of the Orient, and those crops used by us on a daily basis, for example, cotton, tea, coffee, and sugarcane. Of the native objects, they said, those are foregrounded that are of particular interest due to their use and service provided to humans. The park's collections and uses gave expression to and could promote German geography's ambivalence between the idea of a connected, cosmopolitan, albeit increasingly colonial world, and the conception of a distinct nationalist homeland with a deep history whose outlying interests were focused on a few colonies perceived by many contemporaries as inevitable and vital for the nation's progress. The park's vivarium, and especially the geological wall, inscribed the native homeland into the metaphorical cosmos represented by the plantings. The shift towards native materials and an increasingly nativist aesthetic during the first decades of Humboldt-Heinz existence perhaps becomes particularly clear in Humboldt's memorialization in the park. As indicated by its name, the entire park served as a living monument to Alexander. Nevertheless, the park's dedication appeared inadequate, and at the 1869 celebration that had gathered around Humboldt's temporarily erected bust that we see there within the foliage, a foundation stone for a permanent memorial was laid. Its location was ultimately moved to the highest elevation in the park. In 1888, finally, a memorial was built on the park's high ground, following the design of then garden director Hermann Mächtig. Several erratic boulders from various locations within the empire, as well as granite blocks from Sweden, and a plaque were framed by plantings that blended with those already existing in the North American zone where the monument was located. An artificial water source hidden below the boulders created a steady stream of water flowing into a pond lying below. Initially, rocks from all over the world had been intended to form the memorial. Botanist Karl Bolle, disregarding climate suitability, had proposed to frame the boulders with a select yet luscious potpourri of plants from the various geographical regions explored by Humboldt, including, of course, some of the explorers' favorites, like the dragon tree. These effusive cosmopolitan plans were ultimately given up in favor of a more inconspicuous naturalistic design that referenced Neolithic boulder boreals common in the region and beyond, and that blended with the park's existing landscape aesthetics. Boulder boreals, with their implications of deep time and distant civilizations, had already, since the early 19th century, become a motif in the landscape paintings of romantic artists. And I'm trying to forward my slides again and it doesn't work, I'm sorry. Oops, there we go. Okay, so here you see paintings by, among others, Caspar David Friedrich. Assuming a broader view, however, it is precisely the memorial's inconspicuousness and purported naturalness that makes it stand out. On occasion of the 100-year birthday celebrations and in the decades that followed, numerous memorials to Alexander von Humboldt were erected across the world. However, they were mostly of a realist figurative kind, busts and full-sized figures showing a youthful, energetic man exhibiting an exploratory spirit. Epitomizing the global citizen and peaceful discoverer, many US American cities, often with the involvement of their various German associations, celebrated Humboldt by erecting memorials. With big fanfare, Alexander's bust was erected in Central Park in 1869, followed by statues in Philadelphia in 1876, in St. Louis in 1879, and in Chicago in 1892. Humboldt's memorial in Berlin's eponymous park was different. Botanist Bolle saw in it an important complement to the park's naming and to the scientist's figurative memorial that had been commissioned from sculptor Reinhold Begas and erected in 1883 in front of the university. Bolle explained that the Humboldt Pine Memorial would bring the hero of science with international reputation, as he said, back home to the people. And we might add, quite literally, down to earth. Humboldt was renaturalized. The Berlin People's Humboldt, as Bolle called him, in peripheral Humboldtine complemented the Humboldt of science, sedately sitting on the more exigent pedestal in Berlin's city center. The idea of parks as outdoor classrooms for public education in the natural sciences would continue in the decades that followed. In the early 1900s, garden architect Fritz Enke designed Cologne's Klettenberg Park in a former quarry, representing native landscapes and different geological formations typical in the region, including basalt and slate quarries. Inspired by Klettenberg Park and the school garden movement, in Berlin in the 1910s, garden director Erwin Barth designed the 2-hectare encompassing Sachsenplatz, so that it would include planting beds for botanical instruction in the northeast corner of the park here, and otherwise illustrate various regional landscape types in compact form: deciduous and coniferous forests, heathland, dunes, dry grassland, wetland, and a peat bog. Also represented were a moraine landscape and the Rüdersdorfer chalk cliffs east of Berlin, the biggest Mesozoic geological outcrop in North Germany that also delivered the material for the park's paving and retaining walls, so moving from here to the site right there. As in the case of Cologne's Klettenberg Park, the Berlin site was a former quarry offering a varied topography with an overall elevation change of up to 14 meters that could be exploited aesthetically. The quarry was finally turned into the park after the First World War, and the general public could then enjoy the park's central area, however, merely visually from an outside an ivy-clad fence. Only school classes were granted access to the protected core along narrow grassy footpaths. Barth's exclusion of the general public from the park's core to protect its plants and animals reveals the increasing strength of the anti-modern and nativist movement for nature and homeland protection, supported by increasing numbers of garden architects. What had begun in the last decades of the 19th century with the representation of native animals and rocks in Humboldtine for public hands-on experience and immediate object lessons now also assumed an exclusionary character. After the First World War, who would be allowed to partake in the images of the homeland created by various media, including landscape, let alone who was allowed to wander within it, became a question. Many garden architects who were inspired by nationalist Völkisch thought and developed racist sentiments now designed naturalistic scenes to be created with native materials, thus inventing a mythical Germanic homeland. In contrast to what Humboldt stood for during his lifetime, Humboldtine had become implicated in the building of empire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for your wonderful lecture on Humboldtiana and its educational purposes with this organic and inorganic nature exhibited as in a museum or in a mythical German landscape. Thank you very much. We pass the floor to Michael Lee. Michael Lee is a Robin McCorkle Rainey Professor in the History of Landscape Architecture at the University of Virginia. And his research explores the intersection of philosophy, literature, landscape design, with a particular focus on 18th and 20th century Germany. Lee is the author of the German Mittelweg, Garden Theory and Philosophy in the Time of Kant, as well as co-editor of Clio in the Italian Garden and Technology and the Garden. He received an MLA and a PhD from Harvard University and has held fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies and from Dumbarton Oaks. Michael Lee is speech is entitled Humboldt's Tableau as administrative poetics. So thank you very much, Michael, for being with us.
Thank you, Alessandra, and also to the other organizers for this invitation. I very much enjoyed being a part of this and seeing all of you. And before I start, I also just wanted to say I had actually fantasized about delivering this lecture with a lovely Roman espresso in my hand. But unfortunately, the best I can do today is plain American coffee. So anyway, nice to be with all of you. Let me share my screen. Okay, I'll launch right in. Contemporary landscape architectural education has largely abandoned composition, and its aesthetic foundations is a central assumption of studio culture. Design, in the historical sense of a unified spatial arrangement, is increasingly set aside in favor of processes and open-ended developments that are only loosely guided by managerial practices. Moreover, unlike the landscape designers of Humboldt's era, who were gardeners foremost and who typically tended the same sites for years or even decades, today's designers work in urban offices far removed from the sites they influence. Not only do their daily activities differ fundamentally from their forebears, but designers' workflows and vocabularies more closely resemble the administrative culture of their professional peers in non-design disciplines. Studio culture is now producing managers rather than artists, equipped with a skill set foregrounding cartographic analysis, data visualization, and scenario building. Within a pedagogic culture so deeply imbued with administrative sensibilities and habits of seeing, it is difficult to ascertain where a poetics of practice might reside. Humboldt's tableau physique offers a potential way to reconfigure this contemporary dilemma. Although relying on similar practices of assembling, tabulating, and visualizing precisely measured data, it nonetheless operates within a semiotics that was assumed to be motivated by feeling and governed by aesthetics. In Humboldt's text, Views of Nature, or Aspects of Nature, there are several passages that indicate how he understood his tableau. These forms of visual communication were tableau in the sense of both table and picture, and his language suggests how they were meant to be seen. For example, quote, "What the painter indicates with the expression Swiss nature or Italian sky is the vague feeling of this localized character of nature, the blue of the sky, illumination, fragrance borne from afar, the forms of the animals, the succulence of the plants, brilliance of the foliage, the outline of the mountains. All of these elements determine the overall impression of a region," unquote. Another, "With this in mind, whoever is able to comprehend nature with a single look and knows to abstract localized phenomenon will see how, with the increase in invigorating heat from the poles to the equator, there's also a gradual increase in organic power and abundance of life." And a third passage, "If one considers at a comprehensive glance all the plant varieties that have so far been incorporated into herbaria, one recognizes among this wondrous multitude certain primary forms to which many others may be traced back." So Humboldt's language here is striking. Think of the phrases: to comprehend nature with a single look, to abstract localized phenomena, a comprehensive glance, the overall impression of a region. The characteristics enumerated by Humboldt suggest a particular way of looking at nature, capturing both essential qualities, but also being able to scan this information in a single sweep of the eye. I would like to suggest that this dual status is indicative of an administrative way of seeing the world as it began to take shape in its modern form around 1800. In what follows, I would like to outline some of the ways in which we might situate Humboldt's work within this broader development, and also suggest some ways his contributions might help us to think about the possibilities of a poetics within the administrative culture that permeates the teaching and practice of landscape architecture today. To understand Humboldt's mentality, I think it is helpful to begin with his early work and training as a mining administrator. In 1791, he attended the Freiberg School of Mines under the mentorship of Abraham Gottlob Werner, and in 1792 was appointed to a Prussian government position in the Department of Mines as an inspector in Bayreuth and the Fichtel Mountains. In this role, he developed organizational skills that were later to inform his approach to gathering and visualizing large quantities of data in his plant geography. Humboldt's experience in this regard was not unique for his historical context. Landscape management in 19th century Germany was significantly transformed by bureaucratic innovations resulting from the Napoleonic Wars. These changes were especially evident in Prussia, where reforms enacted during the French occupation simplified and rationalized the administrative apparatus by which agriculture, forestry, manufacturing, and the arts were managed by the state. The gathering of data, its configuration into categories, its arrangement in maps and tables, and its mobilization through chains of command were already highly developed practices in Prussian statecraft through a university-based system for training young bureaucrats known as cameralism. Although the expansion of this information gathering capacity was a precondition for remaking the Prussian landscape along the lines envisioned by reformers, it came with a price. The sociologist James C. Scott has described this phenomenon as the statistical gaze or bureaucratic vision, whereby public officials radically simplify social and topographical data for the purposes of administration, while simultaneously transforming physical landscapes to conform to these schemata. Scott and others have outlined the general effect of this bureaucratic process on the German countryside, especially as manifested through river and forest management, including the introduction of gridded monocultures of standard trees, Normalbäume, to facilitate the calculation and prediction of yields. In many respects, Humboldt appropriated these habits of thought, but conversely also sought to compensate for the deficiencies of the calculating gaze. One can see in his tableau the imprint of earlier work by German geographers such as Anton Friedrich Büching, who in his Erdbeschreibung of 1754 used the emerging discipline of statistics to move geographical description toward objective knowledge. The social scientist Hans Erich Bodecker has described the work of Büching and his contemporaries as the development of the, quote, statistical gaze, where he writes, quote, at once enabling and circumscribing the communication of experience, the statistical gaze was a grid or muster for academic social scientists' perception and knowledge, unquote. Seen in this light, Humboldt's single comprehensive glance to abstract localized phenomena has its roots in this strand of German cameralism. With this general background in mind, it is worth looking more closely at how Humboldt's ideas found their way quite early into the teaching of landscape design in Prussia. This absorption of Humboldt's plant geography into landscape pedagogy was the result of his personal relationship with several of the Prussian court gardeners in Potsdam most of whom worked in the gardeners at Sanssouci. Humboldt was a frequent visitor to Sanssouci between 1827 and 1858, making dozens of trips of varying duration. Humboldt was especially fond of staying at Charlottenhof, a project constructed on the southern edge of Sanssouci between 1826 and 1835. It was the collaborative work of the architect Carl Friedrich Schinkel, the garden director Peter Joseph Lenné, and the Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm IV. And it was meant to evoke the notion of an ancient Roman villa modeled after Pliny's letters. Although he often stayed overnight in this summer retreat, taking tea on the curved exedra bench on the terrace, Humboldt actually preferred staying at the nearby, more rustic court gardener's house. This residence, designed by Schinkel and his associate Ludwig Persius to resemble an Italian farmhouse, including connecting pergola, dining stipadium, and an upstairs guest room. The surrounding gardens were meant to recall the vernacular agriculture of the Italian countryside. The court gardener in charge of the Charlottenhof landscape, Hermann Zello, resided here. Zello and Humboldt had met in Paris in 1822 and 23, while the gardener was on a 4-year study tour of Western Europe before assuming his official post. Humboldt was impressed with the young Zello, providing him with funding for the latter part of his study tour, and he continued to enjoy visits with Zello here at Charlottenhof. This is but one example among several where Humboldt befriended the court gardeners at Sanssouci and by which his ideas were transmitted into their work. Not only was this accomplished through personal friendships, but this influence was also institutionalized through the pedagogy of the Court Gardeners Academy at Sanssouci, the first school for the professional education of gardeners in Germany, which was established in 1823. One can see evidence of this in the school's early curriculum. We are fortunate that the Academy made the content of this curriculum available in a set of 12 volumes published between 1837 and 1842 as the reference library for gardeners and gardening amateurs. The first volume in the series dealt with plan drawing, mathematics, and the natural sciences, and was written by Wilhelm Legeler, one of the early graduates and then professors of the Academy. The text includes dozens of problem sets in advanced mathematics, which were to equip future designers with the technical skills to draw base maps and to conduct site surveys. The most striking set of plates in Legeler's text first demonstrated the techniques for rendering presentation plans. Laid out as a visual alphabet, these plates were a compilation of elements that might typically appear in a royal park or garden. With step-by-step instructions, Legeler described how to select the paper, ink the outlines, and lay down successive washes of watercolors to achieve three-dimensional effects. The curriculum not only equipped students with rendering skills, but also established a standardized visual language that would make these plans legible to anyone working within the royal gardens. The standardization of technique and types supported the garden director Lenné's aspirations to elevate gardening to professional status, placing the court gardeners in Potsdam within the social circle of Berlin's professional and managerial classes, the Bildungsbürgertum. The universal legibility of design drawings became especially important with Linné's mounting administrative responsibilities, and after 1830, most of the landscape plans he signed were in fact drawn by his closest associates. Three men in particular assumed this role: Wilhelm Legeler, Gerhard Körber, and Gustav Meyer, who's not shown. All had been trained in the Gardener's Academy. Wilhelm Legeler, in particular, shared Humboldt's love of instruments and precise measurement. He augmented his education at the Court Gardener's Academy with courses in the natural sciences at the University of Berlin, many of which were propounding the results of Humboldt's research. One sees this scientific curiosity and a desire for its landscape application in other areas of his work beyond surveying and draftsmanship. Legeler's volume also included sections on what he termed physics and chemistry. What he meant by these terms was primarily soil science and meteorology in their application to gardening. This plate, for example, shows some of the basic types of cloud formations. Moreover, he kept meticulous records of rainfall in the Sanssouci gardens, some of which were published in scientific journals. This table, for example, covers the years 1845 to 1853. It is likely that Legeler maintained these observations as part of a broader effort within the Sanssouci gardens to improve cultivation techniques through exact data comparisons, as was done in the state tree nursery on the edge of the park. The plots were subdivided for scientific observation so that plants growing under slightly different conditions could be compared with one another. It is noteworthy that Humboldt clearly maintained an interest in Legeler's records, for his Nachlass contains, in fact, one of Legeler's meteorological tables from the year 1851. As a brief addendum to what Sonia has covered in more depth, I wanted to say a bit more about Gustav Meyer's use of Humboldt's notion of plant physiognomy as a basis for planting design. When Meyer expands his discussion of Humboldt's concept in this text, he turns at one point to the philosopher Karl Heinrich Heidenreich. He does so in order to explain a finer point about the nature and source of unity in plant physiognomy. Heidenreich, a professor of philosophy at Leipzig University, had developed a complex garden theory on the basis of Kant's aesthetics, using the figure of the stroller to construct a subjective unity of both concept and feelings, experienced synthetically only after moving through a series of individual scenes. Heidenreich writes at one point, quote, "Were one to venture a similarly bold garden design without considering the natural, lawful development of one view into the other, but moreover regarded this singular arresting vista as the only kind of view without respecting the natural regular development of interstitial space, nor seeing that the whole composition in the stroller's imagination issues like a font from one and the same formative cause, then the overall effect, on which almost everything depends, would certainly be wanting," unquote. The formal consistency between the transitional moments and the primary scenes is based on the notion that they all flow from a single source in its lawful self-development. For Meyer, the most important of these primary causes is the sculpting work of the water cycle on landforms. And he writes in this context, quote, "Therefore, if the whole is to appear as a complete work of art, either as an aesthetic composition or as a microcosm of nature, it must develop on all scales in a manner that is lawful or truthful, that is, faithful to nature. This can happen quite simply when we think about the universal formative sculpting power of a natural cause, water, and express that principle in the design of the whole, unquote. We can sense then a growing bifurcation or division between concept and feeling in the perception of nature, and a desire to hold them in parallel with one another, as in Heidenreich, or to seek a deeper causal unity that gives rise to them, as in Meyer. I suggest that we read these efforts to reconstruct a unity that has been fractured as having their philosophical roots in the sensible knowledge, as it was called, of Christian Wolff, Alexander Baumgarten, and Georg Friedrich Meyer at the birth of German aesthetics. In brief, aesthetics, in its original sense, was only tangentially a theory of art or beauty, and primarily a branch of epistemology. It was aimed at what was termed the perfection of sensible knowledge and expression, serving as a pendant to and a completion of conceptual or discursive knowledge. One way to visualize this new branch of knowledge, as well as the motivation for it, is through the frontispiece of a popular work by Fontenelle on Copernican astronomy. In this image, a noblewoman and a philosopher are discussing the heliocentric theory. They are seated in a French garden, a setting of mathematically ordered nature, while we, the viewer, see in the night sky an image which they cannot. The engraver has made visible to our eye what is perceptible only through intellectual apprehension, something not encountered in sensible experience. As the philosopher Michael Jaeger has argued, this growing rift between the world as understood through mathematical models and the world as experienced through the senses was one of the primary motivations for the development of aesthetics as a discipline. That is, how can we value sense perception and its basis in feeling and emotion within a knowledge culture that increasingly relies upon indirect or mediated observation through precise instruments? Astronomy, at that point, was the paradigmatic case of that tension. So the central problem is, how can we see the whole if we can't really see it? Three concepts in Baumgarten's and Meyer's work in particular are helpful in drawing the through lines to Humboldt's tableau. One concept, the perfection of sensible knowledge and expression, sometimes rendered as sensible knowing and proposing, was to create a perfected sensate discourse, that is, lending unity to a sense manifold. Confused representation, which could also be rendered as fused representation, meaning that representations are clear, but they are confused. That is, as opposed to being very distinct, where we tell them apart, as we would with intellectual concepts. Being fused into a whole is actually probably maybe a better way to think about that in contemporary English. And then finally, extensive clarity, a principle opposed to, say, intensive clarity, where we would emphasize the distinctness of each individual representation. Extensive means increasing the number of marks or signs represented together simultaneously. Therefore, with extensive clarity, the overall impression is richer and felt as a unity. And I would suggest that each of these principles finds its way into Humboldt's tableau. By way of some final reflections, I would like to examine a few images by Humboldt's contemporary, the architect Schinkel. In the first, Schinkel depicts his colleague, Peter Beuth, astride Pegasus, as they soar above a landscape that has been transformed through aesthetic industrialization. Presented as a private gift from the architect to the industrial reformer, it was intended to be slightly humorous and yet make a serious point. The scene is dominated by Boyt, more or less in drag as Fame, who is blowing bubbles containing words that refer to his aspirations as the administrator of this fantasy landscape. He is borne aloft by Pegasus, who signifies that this new Prussian landscape would not grow haphazardly, but rather be guided by classical aesthetic principles. What is less noticeable in the image is the intimate scene below, for it turns out that the vast, almost sublime landscape over which Boyt soars like Lady Godiva in a vision or a fantasy emanates, in fact, from his administrative office. The office, just visible below the parted clouds, is the point from which this new landscape will arise. This sketch was one of several others of a similar type, given by Schinkel to Boyt on special occasions as a token of friendship and of their common cause in the administrative reshaping of Prussia. A second image shows Boyt lost in thought in his offices in central Berlin, in a building designed by Schinkel to house bureaucrats devoted to the advancement of the industrial arts. The room is adorned with artifacts that were the product of new manufacturing methods, older works of art that served as aesthetic models, and stacks of files that were the bread and butter of a Prussian bureaucrat's daily work. Boyt has fallen asleep in his chair and is dreaming of two contrasting scenes. On the upper left is a prosaic domestic scene with the ironic motto, "The final philosophy of life of the great statesman." On the right, we see the Bay of Naples and the island of Ischia, a favorite destination for Germans of this era on the Grand Tour. The inscription above this scene reads, "The vanished youthful dream of the overly busy statesman." A third sketch, now lost, similarly places Boyt in an office. In this case, he has fallen asleep in dreams of his horses and greyhounds, which he kept as his country residence. On the floor are strewn heavy tools and the ever-present official files. The scene behind him opens into two highly distinct but intimately related landscapes. On the right, we see Boyt in a domestic garden, overseeing his gardener and directing his work. On the left, a locomotive, a symbol of the emerging Prussian industry, dominates a countryside that has been radically transformed by this new technology. The quiet life that Boyt enjoys on the right is possible only because of his guiding hand in the profitable industry that creates a very different landscape on the left. The wealth that enables a life of aesthetic enjoyment in the countryside comes at the price of subjecting other landscapes to instrumental reason. And their virtual meeting point, at a physical remove from both, is the administrative office. What unites these three images is the depiction of a divided bureaucratic consciousness. Invariably, the administrative office anchors the composition, but its locus as a center of knowledge and a center of operations is subject to powerful centrifugal forces. Schinkel, Boyt, the court gardeners, and Humboldt all worked under these conditions of divided consciousness, collecting information from distant locations, arranging it through documents and other forms of representation so that it could be comprehended and then acted upon through managerial structures. This tableau by Humboldt, combining and comparing mountain peaks from the old and new worlds based on a sketch by Goethe, repeats this gesture of compressing disjunctive landscapes into a single novel image. What is ultimately at stake here is the precise nature of this synthesis and its effect on the stated aims of Humboldt and his contemporaries to unite beauty with utility, art and science, in the face of emerging conditions in the 19th century that were constantly pulling them apart. So, rather than portraying administration as the stereotypically dry, mundane routine that is the fate of the bureaucrat, I believe that Humboldt's tableaux show that administration can also be conceived as a poetic enterprise. The day-to-day work of landscape design under modern conditions is not so much that of the artistic genius receiving the spark of inspiration. This person is better characterized as an astute manager who shapes and directs these prosaic tasks toward a creative outcome. If we are fated to live in a fully administrated world, as Adorno, among others, would suggest, then perhaps Humboldt's experience at the dawn of this era shows a path forward. Administrative work, that necessary but often dull activity that has now invaded practically every sphere of life, possesses, I hope to have shown, its own aesthetic dimension. Humboldt and his circle were perhaps among the first to grasp the potential of this fact of modern life. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael, for letting us hope of this of this interesting side of the administrative world, in which we are all plunged in our different aspects of society. Also, our universities are completely taken by these aspects, and I'm not sure they are also promising, but we will discuss this later. Thank you very much. So we have now Francisca Lima, who is going to lecture. Her lecture is Embracing Reality and Experience of Landscape Theory Teaching. Francisca is from the University of Edinburgh, and she's a lecturer at the College of Art, where she currently teaches history and theory of landscape architecture. In 2016, she obtained her PhD from ACA ESALA, University of Edinburgh, which focused on the impacts of urban depopulation with a full scholarship from the Portuguese Science and Technology Foundation. Before her doctoral project, Francisca had been collaborating with several Portuguese landscape design offices, as well as with the Philosophy Center and Leaf Research Center in the University of Lisbon. In 2005, Francisca completed her degree in landscape architecture at the University of Lisbon, developing a final dissertation on landscape aesthetics. So thank you very much, Francisca, for being with us. And please, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see the image correctly?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Yes. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be part of this amazing panel. Thank you very much for the invitation and for all the kindness in the process of organizing this conference. It has been quite extraordinary. So as Alexandra has mentioned, my name is Francisca Lima, and I am a lecturer in landscape architecture at the University of Edinburgh, besides also being the director of the Masters in Landscape Architecture. I mainly teach theory, although I also collaborate in some design courses. And I'm going to share some of my concerns or experiences based on the experiences of students in this role within an art school, where teaching through drawing and through making is such a core aspect of the pedagogy that is developed at the school. And I'm going to start by going far back to Ptolemy's Geographia, which presents the known Roman world by the second century of the Christian era, and which is an extraordinary testimony of the geometrical and projection techniques of the time. At this point, already able to transfer with relative accuracy a spheric reality into a plain sheet of paper. From what we know, the relative, From what we know, the relative position of the different points in his map was determined via multiple testimonies that came from the different regions of the empire and that were stored in Alexandria's library, such as sailors' accounts, detailed descriptions of eclipses, relative distance measurements, etc. They were compiled together and studied by Ptolemy and then projected in this map with a conical projection. But Ptolemy's map was mostly concerned with the shape of the Earth as a whole, and so the pieces of dispersed information that were used in this mathematical exercise was very specific. So Ptolemy wouldn't use all and every information available, and some detailed information was dismissed. And in line with this, Ptolemy himself will make a clear distinction between geographia and chorographia, a distinction that is explored by Jesse Simon in this paper, Chorography Reconsidered, an alternative approach to Ptolemaic definition. So whereas geographia is considered by Ptolemy himself as the mathematical rigorous exercise of devising the shape of the Earth as closely to reality as possible, chorographia was, under his view, something best, and I'm quoting now, best left to those who are good at drawing or painting. So he's basically distinguishing, or in a way almost hierarchy, making a hierarchy between geographia, a rigorous discipline, and chorographia. So whereas geographia, protagonized by Ptolemy, is actually aiming towards the globe, to finding the shape of the Earth in a mathematical rigorous exercise, and based on second-hand observations, chorographia, personified by Strabo, the classical geographer from the 1st century before the Christian era, is very much interested in what we would today call the landscape. Hieros in Greek, choro, the land. And it's finding or trying to find a detailed understanding of a place or a region through drawing and through discursive materials like ethnographic or ethnological descriptions. And it's based on first-hand observations, or as much as possible in first-hand observations. In terms of usefulness, there is also an interesting opposition, if we want, because chorographia was useful and in a practical way at the time, not only for travelers, but for imperial power and for imperial possession of these regions, whereas geographia's usefulness became clearer centuries after, or became more clear. But the tension between these two geographical schools is portrayed by Raphael in the School of Athens in this painting, where you see here two figures with a globe One of them facing us is considered to be Strabo, and the one with his back to us is considered to be Ptolemy. And interestingly, both of them have a globe in their hands. So in a way, I would speculate that this fact goes in line with also with what Jesse Simon presents us, which is this idea that the exercise of the choreographer, of the choreographia, is capable of achieving the globe as well. So choreographia, the juxtaposition of several choreographical exercises, will achieve a detailed understanding of the globe as well. And so there is this sense that the drawing itself can be a resource for future knowledge. And the power of drawing as a resource for future knowledge, knowledge that is not yet discursive or speechable, is also explored by Surtot in his practice of everyday life, when he states that procedures without discourse are collected and located in an area organized by the past and giving them the role, a determining one for theory, of being constituted as wild reserves for enlightened knowledge, something that is not yet verbalized, but that can be the future of an idea or a future of a piece of knowledge. And he continues to say the frontier thus no longer separates two hierarchized bodies of knowledge, the one speculative, the other linked to particulars, the one concerned with reading the order of the world, and the other coming to terms with the details of things within the framework set up for it by the first. Rather, it sets off practices articulated by discourse from those that are not yet articulated by it. Now, the boundaries between theory and design in our courses at ESALA are aimed to be increasingly thin or transgressible, if you want. And as a team, we are working towards ever stronger dialogues between the exploration of written arguments, materials, knowledge, and the exploration of the drawing materials. In the first year, for example, students are invited to explore 17th and 18th century English gardens in their history course via sketches, note-taking, and shared panoptical drawings, for example, as in this image that we show, where we invited students to share one own drawing that could be coherent in the end of one same view. Each one of them had to negotiate with their partners next to them until when would they draw. Now, the word theory itself is an interesting one. Thea, which means a view, and horon, to look. So theoros is the one that looks, the one who contemplates. And for example, our student Poppy Main, in one of her essays exploring entitled Observing City Flux Through Insect Eyes, she concludes by saying that noticing the presence of insects in our cities can remind us of the intricate systems we are enmeshed within and rely upon, which humans have the capacity to influence, destroy, and nurture. And she continues by saying it is part of our social responsibility as landscape architects to weave a deeper understanding of the importance and worth of such life support systems into the methods by which we develop spaces, particularly in the urban environment. Now, I have asked some of our past students, so I'm not teaching them anymore, so it's important because I have asked them this exercise once I'm not assessing them anymore. I have asked them to send me a written and an image, a written description and an image of their experiences of the bridge between theory and design in their education. And so they were very kind and generous, and they have sent me their texts and have sent me their images in support. And for example, this image is the image that Poppy has sent me in support of her understanding of this bridge between theory and design. Here is, for example, the contribution of Wendy Wang, our student, now graduating student of the MA in landscape architecture. And she says, obtaining landscape theory education has actually made me more sensitive in observing and thinking in my daily life. So this act of noticing and observing and collecting, actually, because she decided to send me this collection of images that she has been taking in order to analyze how people use urban spaces. And it was a very strong theme of one of our theory courses, how different authors have analyzed the way cities are lived or are dwelt, and how people actually assume the belonging of a space and how they actually leave the urban space. So after that course, she, on her own accord and because of her own interest, she actually started collecting these photographs of people basically occupying the space. For Isabel Milne, for example, is the act of listening that becomes more dominant when she says that an example where I applied theoretical ideas to my design can be shown in the drawing below, which is this pink drawing, where I used community members' memories of the landscape to map the timeline of their place attachments and then extend the timeline to inform a strategy for the design of the landscape. So she has based both her thesis and her final year project, a design project, in this idea that by knowing people's memories and by knowing their narratives of the space, she could best design or could design better, a better proposal. Likewise for Jenny Jones, who won the Best Dissertation Prize, it's also the act of listening that becomes dominant in her understanding of the bridge between theory and practice. And she basically says that in her third year, when developing courses on research called placement research, she saw the benefit of talking to communities as a way of better understanding and better designing as well. So besides noticing, observing, collecting, listening, also this historical context is important for some students, again, when reflecting on the bridge between theory and design. And for this particular student, it is the historical tension between a place that can be very overwhelmingly used or very deserted, the same place, which is a beach in Edinburgh called Portobello Beach that is flocked by crowds in warm days, but normally deserted throughout the year because of the weather that is very, very cold and windy. This tension has always been present in what relates to the touristic exploration of the place. So he basically understood via historical context, by historical contextualization, that the touristic development wouldn't be an easy approach to follow or to propose without some changes or some protections that would basically develop microclimates moments or in the space. Another example is Victoria Johnson, who basically developed this route in her design master plan of platforms that would allow the visitor to become an actor as well as an observer, or to choose between being an actor and an observer. So this exercise of imagining that you belong to a place that you have actually never been to. And this has been also inspired by some of the theories that she had been reading in some of the theory courses on perception of place safety in this idea of purity of place, or a place that is purer if void. And very interestingly, the work of Kate MacLeod, where she basically says or states that the discourse becomes an actor itself, which is quite interesting. She says perceptions of nature from centuries ago and the language we have used to describe it have an influence on the way we plan and design today. So this awareness of the history of vocabulary and of the history of particular words becomes a very important element of these students' design projects. And here you can see an installation with the words that she finds most important. I'm almost finishing. Going back to Surtout, he presents a common saying. That actually Kant presents, where they state that maybe something might be right in theory, but won't work in practice. And he then also presents Kant's argument for this. He says that this is actually a sign that the practitioners insufficient interest in theory, or an insufficient development of theory on the part of the theoretician himself. Apologies for that stumbling. And he concludes by saying that the formal harmony of the mental faculties in the judgment is an art of thinking in which the ordinary practices as well as theory depend. So they are one and the same process. And also linked to this idea that they are one and the same process, but actually personified by two different figures, the theory person and the designer. Here we see an example where actually that division disappears when Stigmar says that Aristotle and Isaac Walton found themselves and others reasoning intelligently or fishing effectively before they formulated the principles underlying the efficient performance of these skills. So if we unite both theory and practice within the same individual, there is a finer tuning of both the skill and the theory, we can argue. And in line with this, I present you also Catriona's McKellar reflection on her theory courses, where she says, after theory classes, we moved straight through to the studio and frequently changed our designs because of our new understandings. Designs we had been confident in the day before became suddenly, had obvious issues after a class where we were discussing similar topics. So we always try to have the theory courses in dialogue with the design courses. And this is a way in which we see how students actually react to that dialogue quite intensely. So although not yet a full practitioner, and once Catriona is a full practitioner, she probably will develop this one individual process of exploring theory and design at the same time. Catriona's statement actually resonates with the balance between geographia and choreographia, that travels between one and the other, which is also a balance that was explored by Humboldt, actually to an unprecedented level, from the plant to the region to the cosmos throughout his life, which is an unbelievable process of exploration. And also this balance between geographia and choreographia, between first-hand experiences to a worldwide network of collectors of information for his book, Cosmos. I would like to finish by thanking all our landscape students who are eager to learn, eager to practice, and have been so generous in actually sharing their own experiences in our courses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisca Lima, for taking us into the teaching methodologies you're following in Edinburgh. And now we go into the design studio, the course of Professor Gunther Vogt, a landscape architect that realized his office partnership with Dieter Kinest in year 2000, and with the projects such as the Tate Modern in London, the Allianz Arena in Munich, or the Mazoala Rainforest Hall at the Zurich Zoo. The film has achieved very important prizes and international recognition. So his work is characterized by the dialogue established between the various disciplines and its close cooperation with artists. Since the year 2005, Gunther Vogt has been pursuing a combination of teaching practice and research and at the ATH in Zurich. And also we know he's now developing here in Rome the project for Via Giulia together with the studio of Francesco Garofalo and Sharon Miura. Long-lasting project, slow, but hopefully sooner or later we will have something happening. Thank you very much, Professor Gunther Vogt, for being with us. And the title of the lecture is Process Cartography.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for the invitation. I feel a bit uncomfortable after all these historical explanations. It's about, I thought, I was briefed that it's about landscape design, education, and practice. So that's always been between the university, the students, and the practice. So it will be completely different that what you heard until now. What I'm showing now is always a teamwork. As there are always some students involved from the ETH especially, but for international students as well. But it's not as theoretical. And Francisca mentioned right in theory, but wouldn't work in practice. So I would say this is the example. Right in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. So we are going much closer to it. And it was my briefing that it's about education and practice. What you see here is the very famous painting from Siena underneath, showing the city on the left-hand side and the landscape on the right-hand side. And I cannot go close, but on the left-hand side, you see more or less 90% of the people are women. On the right-hand side, more or less men. That already 400 or 500 years ago, it was a very clear, only the craftsmen on the rooftops are men, the rest are women. So that means, in a way, the message behind was that the city is in the end a female idea, and the landscape is a male idea, to very simplify it. And when you look on the top photo image, that's very close, you would see our office in the on the left-hand side, where you have two rivers, one the left hand coming from the lake and the right hand coming from the landscape. And that means if you compare these two presentations, it's the top is about knowledge, and the Siena is about the image. So there is a real difference. What we really teach our students, there is a difference between knowledge-based design and image-based design. And I constantly have to explain to my students, mainly architectural students, but meanwhile we have for 1 year now a landscape master, that what we are doing is not art. That's very difficult to explain our students that it's not art. It's definitely not art. And you will see a lot of collaboration we are doing with artists, but that's only possible because we relate to landscape architecture, not to architecture and not to art. And that's really important to have a basic position or an approach or an attitude where you start from. And it's not land art, especially not in terms of art. I think since 1973, we don't have land art at all. This is a work by Hamish Fulton, a friend of mine. This is English walking artist saying what I'm doing, walking, and then thinking about the landscape is not land art. This is really after Robert Smith and Gordon Matta Clark and all these people from the 60s in the US. It really disappeared somehow. And it's you still have Richard Long and Hamish Fulton, this English tradition, walking artist. And this is a very interesting approach to landscape, but our work is not art and it's not land art. And of course, we are doing exhibitions ourselves, like 2 years ago in the SciArc in Los Angeles, where we translate our understanding of urban landscape into an exhibition. But again, this is not really art. It's really a translation. In this case, the architects wanted to show projects, and it's mirroring in these small water ponds, and it's a bit too long to explain what the content was of this exhibition. And I would say that landscape architects are not really working on the translation, or let's say on the transfer, what we are doing in landscape architecture to architects, to art, and we should do much more in translating what we are doing. And here it was just a translation of the Los Angeles wider territory into an exhibition space where architecture was exposed. So, but in the beginning, very short, because I don't have so much time, the common ground, we all agree what common ground means, but when I ask my students, what do you mean? Because they all show me the Nolli plan, as you're familiar with in Italy. But what is different to the Nolli plan of Rome today to the real Nolli plan in 1748? And they really don't find it out, but you can see that the churches were a public space. So that means homeless people could stay overnight and sleep there and so, but today it's closed. There is a constantly change of what is a common place or what is really a public space. And so to discuss it with the students, so it's a constant change. It's not static. So the urban territory is not a perception. You can do it today. 10 years from now, it can change. And here it's very obvious with the Nolli plan. So that the public spaces in those days were including the church spaces. And today it's not. Then the next thing we try to explain to our students is this idea of privatization, events, and surveillance. I just show one project. It's Eiffel Tower, where we did the renovation of this little park under this tower. And now it's protected against terrorism. So it's no longer a park for the neighborhood. It was until two years ago, but now it's completely fenced off. So that means it's privatized. So people living around would have to wait at least 3 hours in the high season, or even 4 hours in the high season to get in. So therefore, it's no longer a neighborhood park. But before, it was a neighborhood park, and it's extremely protected against this terrorist attack. And as you know, this kind of privatization, we mainly have it in the UK, where newspapers in the UK published a plan, 28 public, so-called public spaces and fake public spaces. And I have to say 3 of these fake public spaces are designed by us. But this is a real problem for the future. What is really private? What is public? I don't allow my students to say semi-public or semi-private, because it's only about private or public. The rest, semi-public, is designed somehow by people using these open spaces. But that's a real problem in the European city, that we have a lot of fake public spaces. And then the next topic, and I'm really talking what I'm teaching to the students, the built urbanity against the lived urbanity. It's a theory by the French Marxist philosopher Henri Lefebvre. There is a difference between what you plan and how people perceive it. And you see it here. This is a project by our office in Bremen, the transformation of a harbor area. On top, it's really a nice design, and it's always published in every magazine and publications and so on. But the reality is on the bottom, is where people really use it. And there is a difference between the built reality and the lived reality. And what's really important, what's very difficult to explain to students, typology. So that means if you start to design, what is the type of this free open space? I mean, is it a courtyard? Is it a plaza? Is it a square? What is it? And I'm not asking for a copy, but it should be a starting point. And then you can transform it and whatever the outcome is, but it's very helpful to have a certain type. And here it's a stadium in Munich, where we started in our design saying it's a landscape. And it is a landscape for people living there, not during a football game before or after, but between Monday and Wednesday, and between Wednesday and Saturday. It's really a landscape for people living around. And this is an approach, whatever it means for the design. This, I think in the European cities, we should always think about this type. What is it? Like here, a street space in Basel, close to the railway station in Basel. It's not this traditional arrangement you would expect with lines of trees and alleys. Let's say we are 500 meters from France, but it's not this French idea of a street space. It's really dealing with this landscape on the other side, where the railway station is, with birch trees, willows, and so on. And it's not an urban understanding. It's more a landscape understanding with invasive species and so on. But nevertheless, to understand, it's really a traditional approach. What is a street space? And I think especially in landscape architecture, we always forget the street space in the European city. Therefore, the streets and the street space are so really awful. And then a courtyard, again, a typological question. In the beginning here, it's 2 courtyards in Zurich. So we couldn't plant any trees because, as you know, you have no soil and so on. But what is then the idea of our design? There is always something behind. And in this case, it was, okay, we cannot plant a forest or trees. So we are dealing with what's left. I mean, without the trees, you have the soil, you have the surface of a forest. That means mosses and water. And so this was the starting point. And it's not a traditional courtyard, it's really the transformation of a type into a new design. And that's for us really important. And the last one, transformation of a former symmetry, again, very close to the railway station in Basel, a transformation of a symmetry into a park. So we had to keep, of course, all the existing trees, but we made a new design for this park and a new relationship and new connections and so on, so that it really works in the urban grid. But we kept all the trees. It's a kind of arboretum. It's like a botanical garden there, because there are so many different species. And walking through, you can understand this is a kind of special place, but the choreography is completely different to a normal park. And then again, the visible versus the invisible nature. And what you see here is a courtyard in Zurich for the International Federation of Football, a courtyard where they asked us to create for all 5 continents a special garden. And this is a courtyard open to the sky without any glass on top. And this is a North American rainforest left after we built it, and right 5 years later. So this means that what you see here are mammoth trees, really living mammoth trees, and of course artificial ones, as you see here, 16 tons. And since the people cannot go close to these trunks, they really believe that this is nature. And that's interesting that people believe in nature, and meanwhile we have birch trees and ferns growing on these trees out of concrete, and people cannot touch it. And so it's more or less 3-4 meters away, but they parked their car underneath. But they really don't have this spatial understanding what it means, and it's a kind of diorama or a cabinet of curiosity. So it's that people really have a specific perception on it, and that's for us important. It's not about what is natural or what is artificial. And of course, ecology and sustainability, one of our most important ecological project is this Laban Center in London with Herzog and de Meuron. So we were not allowed to plant any trees because there is a very rare species, a little bird, the black red start living there. And if you would plant trees, crows would attack it. And we were not allowed to take away the soil because it's heavily contaminated. We could move it. So we shaped it, no trees. The birds' nests are now on the rooftop, but no trees in this artificial landscape. But it's extremely shaped and in relation to this dance theater. And that's for us important, and especially with the students, to explain them that ecology or sustainability is not always visible. And the last one is a courtyard we did in Basel again for Novartis with Sanas, a Japanese architectural company. What you see here is in summertime. It's a precise landscape out of sandstone and water, different deepness of water. So only 5 centimeters, 10, 15, 20 centimeters. But in wintertime, it's completely covered by fog because this water is coming from an industrial process. And that means in wintertime, it has about 15 degrees plus. That means it's very warm compared to -5 in Basel. So we have a lot of fog production coming from this industrial water. And this is extremely atmospheric, of course, but it's invisible again. What are we doing? And we are cooling down the water, we're giving it back to the River Rhine. It's not always visible what we are doing. And everybody's asking me, yeah, about this atmospheric, and I had a lecture last week in Venice. So are we still talking about space? And of course we are talking about space. And all this discussion about how are you doing this atmospheric design, it all has a background, and it can be image-based or knowledge-based. And that how we organize our program with our students, it's always like that. It's, of course, it's a bit compacted, analyze and research, program and gestalt, development and communication. And this is always the basic didactic concept. So really our students have to understand, and what does it mean, process cartography? At least in the program, in the middle phase, program and gestalt, they should have a kind of first design. They shouldn't believe that they are like Leonardo or all the famous painters or so, that they really design it. It's coming out of this analytical and research work and the program. And then before they really start to design it, they should already have, how can I compare it? I will show afterwards one image. It should be a water sign as you have it in the paper, where you show it against the light. You see the water sign. It's already there after these two first stages. And then they have to really design it in detail, and then they have to communicate it. And this is important for us, that it's not, let's say, I'm not the designer of our office. So first of all, we are always working in a team. And then through discussion, we get to a design. But after and we are, if I would say the first third of the process is the most expensive for our office, because we do a lot of analytical and research work. The rest is in terms of money and commercially not so expensive. The most expensive part is really this analytical and research part. And this is for really important when we explain it to our student, what can be interesting in this special landscape and in this special program or project. So I show you now finally two projects. One is knowledge-based design. It's a learning center for the pharma company Novartis, together with Peter Zumthor. You see it's the red line is the convention, it's the border of the Alps. It's just on the border between the Alps and the northern part of the Mittelland in Switzerland, pre-Alps and outside the Alps, whatever. And of course, I cannot show you everything. I could always show you a complete book of our research. And I'm often asked, especially in Germany, how is it possible to do such an intensive research you always do for your project? It's very easy to explain. So we constantly do research, and we have an internal library where all my colleagues can relate to. So it's not always from scratch. So we always have a basement of research already, what we did before in different regions, not only in Switzerland, but in Italy and in Germany or in France as well. So it's not, we don't start from scratch. We build up our own knowledge, and that's really important. And as you can imagine, when we look at this image, geologically, it's extremely special, and it's super Swiss. When you look at the image in 1950 on the left and the topographical map, it's a wonderful landscape. It's a very Swiss, beautiful landscape. And but then we found out Turner from our side, exactly from our side, where we planned a new park and the buildings with Peter Zumthor. Turner painted, I think, 5 different paintings. The blue, the rose, and the red, and whatever, the Rigi. And then we read his texts about his paintings. And he was saying, the Swiss mountains are really beautiful, but I'm missing the twin light. So in what you see is the Swiss alpine landscape with the English twin light on top. Meanwhile, I had it once that I saw a twin light in Switzerland, but Turner didn't see it. And he, let's say, he copied the English landscape on the Swiss landscape. And this was for us a really a good starting point. And then we asked ourselves, why are, you see it on this map, 6 very famous gardens are on this side of the lake, not on the other side. And the last one we are working on. And then we ask ourselves, but why are these gardens only on this side? And it has to do with what Turner found out with this post-glacial landscape. It's extremely topographic, and Turner is describing it. It's a kind of English park in front of the high mountains, up to 4,000 meters, but in front, in the foreground, middle ground, and background. Here, the topography is shaped by the glacier, and we found this written comment by Turner very interesting, how he saw it as an English painter. And then what I was saying before, the water sign, the left one, Peter Zumthor always asked me whether he can get this sketch, and it's very easy. This is the concept. What you see in black on the left-hand side, it's a hill, it's a valley, and it's a delta. And it was very easy to understand the hill and the delta because it's a valley. It's a hill and the valley. It's very easy. You see it. It's obviously, it's 90 meter high, the hill against the lake, and then you have a valley. And of course, you can, if you have all this natural science understanding, it's related to geomorphology. But then we found out the yellow lines is the deltas. There is a small river nearby. So we have 3 landscape types, not only 2. And this was already the design. It's very easy. Perhaps you don't believe me, but it was the design finally. So before we start to design, we already have it through the process cartography. And it's not mapping. It's really to understand the landscape and to read the landscape. And on the right-hand side, then Peter Zumthor proposed to have all the building on columns, so pilotis. So the buildings are not touching the ground. This coming out of our idea, inspired by our analysis. He said, okay, we will not touch the ground with our buildings. So all buildings are on columns or pilotis up to 5-6 meters. And I cannot show you everything. It would fill up at least 3-4 books. And we built a lot of models and how the spaces are organized. But here you see the final drawing with all the forests, a lot of tree planting. But if you remember this hill, the valley, and the delta, it's already designed. It's designed. We don't have to design it anymore in a traditional way. And this is for us really important and what we are doing with our students. So the last one, image-based design. So we are not fixed, and let's say if you ask one of your students whether he can build a ship, he can build it in a glass bowl, or he can, as an engineer, build it as an engineer. Here real ship or in a miniature. And this approach, we constantly keep it open to our students. What is your approach? Is it from bottom up or from top down? Bottom up means it's like bricolage. You take whatever you have on your table and then you make your project. Top down is an engineering work. You can take many things from outside, but you do it top down. And here it was a bit in Moscow, a project where we had to, let's say, to plant a park or a woodland or a forest. And we found out this opushka. This is a very strange Russian expression. It's the entrance of a forest. Here it's the edge of an oak forest, but we found many examples of what is the entrance of a forest. And we, of course, transformed it then through sections in a concept, and we did a lot of research. I cannot show everything. And this is the final design. And how it looks like, this forest is, these buildings are on columns, 40 meters high, and then you have 40 meters of apartment, and underneath there is a forest. It's mainly to keep these historical buildings behind. You see it a bit in red, or here you see it a bit better. So it's a kind of protected view from the other side of the river, but there is a forest under this building. Don't ask me technical questions, but it's possible. Meanwhile, after 4 years, it's possible to do what we are proposing. But here you see, it's not, of course, we did a lot of research in terms of scientific maps and so on, but finally the approach was through this Russian tradition of the entrance of a forest. It's a very, for me personally, it's a very strange expression. How can a forest have an entrance? And this is, and to finalize, a photo from yesterday. Again, I'm not an artist, and hopefully all my colleagues are not artists. This is an exhibition we will open in 2 weeks. It's a very famous museum in Basel by Renzo Piano. And we are working here with Olafur Eliasson again. And we opened the building on the front side. You don't see any glass facade. And the landscape is flooding the museum. It's not an exhibition. You don't have any kind of art in the museum, but the landscape is going, well, what does it mean? I mean, landscape cannot go, but it's flooding the museum. And what you see now, it's more or less green color, but meanwhile, we added some plants. You see it black baskets on the left-hand side, and there is a catwalk. And we have two different systems with light, one for the plants that they can grow, and one for the art. So that means it's vice versa between nighttime and daytime. It will be like the other position. In nighttime, it will look like daytime, but it's very difficult now to explain with light conditions. But people see at it, it's like supernature, but it's not. I mean, this green is not, it's even a little bit radioactive, I have to say. But it's not nature, but it looks supernature. And there we are really interested in this, and I think the future of landscape architecture is really this exchange between the disciplines, art, architecture, us, hydrologists, whatever. And that's for the future very important. And I think we should explain it to our students. They are not alone. They really have to look for support from different disciplines. And yeah, that's our interest, and my personal interested to deal with students. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunther Vogt, and don't worry, you were not out of tune. We were asking actually to somehow think how the legacy of Humboldt and Haeckel had an impact on today's teaching landscape architecture in the different schools. So I think that you have answered to this question, showing us the process cartography methodology based on this basic design or image design that you have spoken about, and especially the cooperation between all the disciplines. I think it's part of Humboldtian thinking or Haeckel's thinking, I think, and so I think it's interesting. Thank you to all our guests. Now we have a half an hour discussion with all of you. Rita Biasi and Fabio Di Carlo, who are two professors of our PhD program. Rita Biasi is Associate Professor of Arboriculture and Tree Crop Productions at the Department of Innovation in the Biological, Agro-Food and Forest System of the University of Tuscia. She's PhD in tree crops and agronomist and president of the joint bachelor degree in landscape and environmental planting and design of Sapienza. We have a common program in landscape for the first 3 years together, University of Tuscia and University of Sapienza. And Fabio Di Carlo is, he teaches landscape design at Sapienza. He's director of the Master in Landscape Architecture, president of IASLA, Italian Academic Society of Landscape Architecture, and board of member of the European Council of Landscape Architecture Schools, and also of the scientific committee of Volubilis Réseau Euro-Méditerranéen pour la ville et les paysages. I would like to give them the floor to handle a little bit a discussion regarding landscape education in these schools. And so please, I think it's Fabio starting, right? Fabio, you don't have the...
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for your presentation, and thank you to all our guests for these two very interesting afternoon for the yesterday keynote, but also for the today guests that all presented us a very various and articulated panorama of the point of view and thoughts of teaching landscape architecture from different perspectives. It's a bit late, so I'll be very short. I want to talk about two things. The first, I want to present a short resume of the situation of teaching landscape architecture in Italy. Italy, unfortunately, is a bit late in spreading of landscape education, even if a lot of Italian scholars have been active since the 50s of the past century, also collaborating in the foundation of IFLA. But for several decades, the teaching of landscape architecture was almost random in our university. Sometimes was optional in architect studies. It was only in the beginning of the 90s that in Italy started some specialization school for architects in landscape architecture, in particular in Genoa, in Florence, and in Rome. After 10 years, in 2000, were founded a bachelor and a master courses for landscape architect also in Italy. And now we can say that landscape teaching and landscape studies in general is getting relevant in 6 or 7 universities in Italy. So it's a very different panorama from the past century. Nowadays, there are 5 master degrees and several bachelor. Most of them could be considered highly interdisciplinary because most of them are realized with the collaboration of different ateneums, and in particular from different departments, like the experience of Rome, where the design department, the architecture and design department of Sapienza, together with the forest and agricultural department of Tuscia, work together from more or less 8-9 years. Rome in particular is the only place where we can have a bachelor, master degree, and a PhD program all together. Well, if we can say what was the main character of the of the Italian study, surely we can say that all these courses, in all these courses, we can find a mix of study between environmental and geographical condition, together with the historical, cultural, and physical study of transformation. In some courses are more focused on cultural landscape and or to the heritage, historical and archaeological landscapes that you can understand that in Italy are very important. But I can argue that everywhere there is a strong attention to the quality of landscape design processes. We all believe in teaching through design, as Francisca told before. Everywhere, I can say we are very focused on not separating quantitative and qualitative approach to designing projects, where we can try to find a balance, between the ecological and environmental needs, well related to the art, aesthetic, and designing approach. And well, the second short consideration is relating the importance of von Humboldt and Haeckel in this reasoning. Obviously, we must consider these two immense figures as the basis of the landscape architecture, together with the other pioneers like Olmsted or Alfan that someone today quoted. Surely all together are the basis of the evolution of our disciplines. But I think that they are very important that because after the filter of the 20th century, after the filter of the new science of the 20th century, from Einstein and Laszlo to the theory of complexity of the 70s and the 80s, they arrived to us with a very strong suggestion for us. The first I think is the suggestion to overcome every action of reductionism in knowledge and in design activities. I think that the necessity to overcome the verticalization of knowledge of the 20th century is at the basis of our contemporary approach, and I think that transdisciplinarity and horizontal approach is common of most of us here in this Zoom room. Similarly, probably their approach could be very useful to overcome another theoretical barrier, that is the approach by scale. Today, all of us, I think, also in the studies that are in Harvard or are in Philadelphia, or are also in the school of our friend our friend Michael Lee. We think and we work on to overcome any separation from local to global. We surely work it to overcome this color approach, to understand that there is no project that cannot link the immensity of the geography, perception, and knowledge with the detail of the science and the gardens. For example, Richard Weller and his atlas of the end of the world is an interesting example of this approach, I think. They also, von Humboldt and Haeckel, suggest us that complexity is a positive challenge for us, that give us more and more element and suggestion, and is not a limit to our action. Also, thanks to the new the new tools for managing complexity, I think. So they can help us to understand that landscape architecture is inclusive, and that landscape architect is a sort of movie director, a kind of coordinator of knowledge, of languages, of poetics, that surely landscape architect is a kind of figure that shape the need of ecology, the need of society through design process. Thank you.
Rita, you want to?
Yes, thank you for giving the floor. I was really impressed during these 2 days because I really learned a lot. I learned a lot. I understood how precious is the legacy of the past, and probably we didn't have to forget, but we probably put in one side this legacy of complexity. I just want to stress 3 concepts, 3 points that I ripened during these 2 days, and particularly this afternoon, and starting from this last presentation from Professor Gunther Vogt, because he stressed how much research there is behind a project, and how much research surely is in teaching methods. And high quality teaching is based on research. I'm personally an agronomist. I'm teaching one earth science that I understood in the past was the base on landscape education, botany, soil science, agronomy, horticulture. But while in the past, science was part of landscape education, but landscape wasn't part of science. This landscape is part of science since very few years. I explain better this concept. Agronomy, soil science, botany, and forest science didn't have landscape as a research questions until a few years ago. These disciplines were dealing with a productive question, but didn't take into consideration the implication on landscape. Only recently, we have gained the landscape dimension thanks to landscape ecology. And I really appreciate also Pablo Perez Ramos' presentation, because we understood that landscape ecology is part of landscape design, and the design let the design to gain a shape. But the landscape ecology is also important because design the landscape indirectly. Farmers I have understood the importance of ecology. And now farmers are designing orchards, vineyards, dealing with ecological question. And so now I think landscape is more integrated in these basic disciplines. And recently in Italy, we have published one manifesto of agroforestry landscape that was promoted by some scientific societies, Society of Agronomy, of Forest Science, and others. This is, this is stressing that the fact that now landscape is part of these basic health disciplines. The second question is that probably starting with the undergraduate courses, we have to deal more with method of learning instead of matter concepts. In the scientific publication, there are a lot of papers and articles that are stressing the fact that the sustainable development needs an approach, a way of problem solving, of considering methods, tools that we have to teach students that are going out of the high school and enter a university program. This, I think, is a great challenge. And Michael Lee, that presented how in the past this way of mix multi-source investigation, multidisciplinary approach was probably the normal way of teaching landscape. And now in our university program, are trying to recover this interdisciplinary, intersected way of thinking. And because because we have to teach students to share terminology, to share languages, because the profession is a way of get in touch with different expertise and to understand each other. And the last point is related to what Francisca Lima said, that I really liked a lot, because yesterday Alessandra Capuano started with one point that I completely agree with. Now, today we have wonderful tools and instruments to study the landscape. We have unmanned aerial vehicles that create point clouds. We have the possibility to manage big data and to have a landscape reconstructed, reproduced in very few hours, but without getting in touch with the real environment. So probably we have really to go back to the contact with the nature. And what Francisca is doing with her students, we are doing with our students. We we stress the importance to go to the field, to get in touch with the environment, because only in this way students can understand the real dimension of the environment and they can control them. Probably we have to go back to stress more the importance of gardening, to let students know how to plant a tree, how to choose a tree, how to prune a hedgerow. Go back to that horticultural school of horticulture that were part of the historical gardens, not Kew Garden, but I understood also elsewhere, that we consider something different from the landscape education, but probably are the base of landscape education. probably it's because I'm an agronomist, but I think this learning how to care, look after a place is learning how to care Earth in terms of a planet and in terms of a soil, in terms of a living matrix. And that's it. I really thanks all of you because you gave me a lot of suggestions, and I think we can optimize our intersection, starting really from the beginning, in order to let the master students to be perfect landscape architects. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rita. Maybe we do a short little tour of answers. Gunther Vogt, you want to say something? According to the comments that have just been made, or
yeah, I'm not so sure whether it's good to bring them to bring them. Of course, I agree. The student should be more in contact with the so-called nature. I would more say to landscape. I don't think that we still have nature in Europe. So to landscape and to the production, how to plant the trees. But the real problem is what I see, for instance, we now have a master for 1 year in landscape architecture at the Department of Architecture. And it was coming from our president. They all have to have a bachelor in architecture, and then asked why? Because then they can design. We have for 5-6 years now a department for environmental studies, agronomists, forest people, and all this. If we introduce a master in landscape at the Department of Architecture, it's about design. And it was super clear. What we are really missing is the design aspect. And by the way, they didn't agree to have a master in urban planning. If we are really thinking about the future of the city, it has to come from the landscape architecture. Of course, we have all these environmental people, but it has to come from design. And that means to design landscape. And in the beginning, it was a bit unsure, but it's, I have to say, it's not so bad that our president, he's a physics professor, not coming from the landscape or architectural field. It was very clear. What's really missing is the design aspect and not the environmental aspect. If you need support from the environmental people, like agronomists, forest people, whatever, you have to work interdisciplinary. But what we are really missing is design. And I really agree, because landscape, as I mentioned, is really a cultural production, especially, I don't have to tell you, in Italy, it's very special and it's really on the top of it, that it's a cultural production. It's not just nature, it's really what do you see in the landscape? And I think that's really important. And I would say we are still talking in the landscape discipline about ecology. I'm more talking about landscape economy. You know, I had a lecture in Frankfurt 2 years ago, and then the head of the forests of a middle-sized German town explained, yeah, you know, I have 10 people working in my forest, and we are cutting down trees, and it's all in a good financial situation. And then I told him, but listen, this is not your economy. This is not about selling wood to firewood and so on. The real economy is producing fresh air, producing shadow, cleaning rainwater. That's the real economy. And then we are not talking about millions, we are talking about billions. And that should be our goal, that we are not only talking about ecology, because everybody agrees to it. We should talk about economy. What is the value of the landscape? And that's for the future much more important than ecology, because ecology, sustainability, all our students believe what they do is really ecological, and you even have in Italy, in Milan, vertical forests, and all my students believe this is extremely sustainable, but listen, this is not ecological and sustainable. It's only an image, no? Let's go further behind, and then let's talk about economy. And that's really, and not in terms of euros and so on, but what is the economy of our landscape? That's I think we should start to think about it. And not only, but I can completely understand what you're saying about ecology. It still remains, of course, but finally it's about economy, especially, I mean, some students in Milan asked me, but what are you talking about? And then I explained, listen, Paris, old Paris, you have the historical city center, very narrow street and beautiful and picturesque, whatever. And then Haussmann arrived. He destroyed 23,000 buildings to bring the military and the police. It was a political statement to bring the political power into the city center. That's the level of intervention we will have in future, especially, by the way, in the Mediterranean cities. And then I asked the Milanese students, can you imagine that the most beautiful plaza in the world, in Siena, is a forest? What do you mean? This is the scale of the intervention, because you were talking about scale, and this will really be the discussion that we have to completely change our perception of the street because of climate change, and to bring fresh air in. And since two years ago, nobody was talking about that. Around 5,000 elderly people died in the city center of Paris because of the heat. That's the real dimension. And then we are talking, this is a kind of economy. So we have to take down buildings to have meadows leading into the city center because of the climate. And this will be really the new dimension. And then it's becoming extremely economical.
Thank you, Gunther. I'm going in the order of the pictures I see here. Sonia Dumpelman. You said you wanted to speak a little bit also about the teaching in your school after the historical.
Sure. Yeah. No. I can maybe just continue a little bit along the lines of what Günther Fuchs just said, and pass the baton on to perhaps Michael, because I think what was just said about economy is precisely parts of what actually Michael was presenting to us. And so, you know, all throughout the 19th century and even before, a lot of the discussions around landscape, especially, I mean, one of the examples that was hinted at in Michael's talk was forestry, of course. And a lot of the landscape design, if you so will, in this period is very closely tied to economic concerns in all possible ways. And what I presented, of course, is also related to it, because if you think about the discussions about nativism and colonialism in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century, then again, it's all about wealth. So having said this, obviously we cannot lose out of sight what the social implications of any of this is. And I think, you know, I think kind of butting the one against the other might not necessarily be helpful if we're talking about ecology versus the, you know, social aspects. I think they all need to kind of go together and tie together. And that's the big task that I see ahead in terms of teaching is again, maybe this ideal, which is also one of the ideals of Humboldt. I mean, he was kind of very much thinking the world comprehensively and holistically. And so I think this is one of the teachings that he can, or that we can kind of cull from this if we look back into this history. And lastly, maybe one point that I do want to bring up, the teaching of the history of landscape, gives so many examples of many of the things that we are addressing today, but we'll have to be addressing in the future. And to just focus on the practice and the future of practice is not enough. So I think we need to understand the past. And since landscape architecture is a very young profession, there's a lot of work to do in that respect. And so this is also a component of landscape architectural education that I think needs to certainly be maintained and perhaps even be strengthened in schools. So I'll leave it at that for now. So
thank you, Sonia. So since you mentioned Michael Lee, I will give him the floor. And I also saw that Anita managed to join us. Thank you very much. Michael, please.
Well, sure. First, it was actually quite wonderful to hear so many different perspectives to the same prompt. So it was very, very instructive for me to hear how other people looked at these connections. I think one of the bigger themes too that came out for me was the relationship between landscape pedagogy at the university level and encounters with real physical sites. And I think, Humboldt is just a very nice way to think about this bigger question. How is it that we make the translation and help the students make translation from real physical places into some form of visualization or representation that can be the basis then for proposing different futures or different outcomes? In the context I looked at, presented to you today, I could have shown a whole series of designed agricultural landscapes, produced by this same group of landscape gardeners, which I think is an area of practice that was quite serious and central to a lot of the concerns, as Sonia has underscored, which is maybe perhaps not as prominent or even lost in many versions of practice today. I think that's something our students are very interested in recovering and building upon because they see it as a connection both to the physicality of place and local economies in particular. Just to say a little bit about the studio culture at the University of Virginia, we, over the last couple of years, have been trying to make use of an old airfield, not a very big one, but a very small airfield, not too far away, as a lab of sorts that our students can use for various purposes. We currently have a studio being run there right now. One early version of this was having the students actually build from scratch sensing instruments of their choosing that they would install out there on the site and then get continuous feeds of data back into the studio that they could use as the basis for both analysis and potentially design proposition of some kind. So remote sensing, I immediately started thinking of Humboldt and his instruments. This past fall, I co-taught a studio with our department chair, Bradley Contrell, who, as many of you probably know, has a wide-ranging research in simulation and modeling of landscapes, both physical models, that is, as well as in the digital world. We had intended to do a studio in Berlin, but of course, like everyone could not travel. We had to rethink this studio very quickly. And he came up with the idea of recasting what we intended to do under the umbrella of the surveillance state. So we did a whole studio on the surveillance state just as a condition of contemporary society and technology, its social implications, thinking about specific histories of surveillance in Berlin itself, with different government regimes along the decades. And it was a real challenge to basically introduce the students to a deep dive into a place most had never been. There's how do you get to know a place in any depth? What kinds of data streams are available? They were getting things from security cameras, all over the city. They were diving into a lot of the governmental document files, mappings, and I again was thinking, it was maybe his lessons from Humboldt, in the way that this vast array of information could be gathered, it could be synthesized, put together in some form that can be scanned and perhaps some level of understanding a city. At the same time, maybe serving as a critique not only of the surveillance state per se, but even our current understanding of the smart city, as it's being presented to us. So that's a brief take really on what some of our studio culture is doing in this direction, with maybe some Humboldt themes.
Thank you very much, Michael. Pablo, Perez Ramos, and Anita, you want to please?
Yes, thank you, Alessandra. Yes, I would also like to maybe make some connections between the things that we've talked about today and some of the ideas that were presented also yesterday by Franco Farinelli and by Rainer Wilhelm. I guess primarily the reverberation that exists between science and politics and with design. Yesterday we saw with the lecture by Professor Wildman on Haeckel that it's very difficult to extricate the political dimension from science. He reminded yesterday about the political implications that could be extracted from the debate between monogenism and polygenisms, monogenist and polygenist, I guess, views of mankind and how polygenism has been historically used to exercise or to justify slavery. So a dynamic and evolutionary perspective of humans, helped science to explain the common ancestry of the various human races. But then again, we saw also how, the theory of evolution itself has been politicized, with ideas of social Darwinism that come immediately to mind, So ecology, it emerges as a science that that was invested in the understanding of the relationships that existed between different organisms and between organisms and the environment. So there seems to be no political project in the inception of ecology, but it seems over the past 150 years, I think it became clear that understanding those relationships has inevitably led to the manipulation of those relationships, and that has made ecology a political project. Like you modify ecological relationships, and every intervention, I guess, implies a modification of the given conditions, and you modify those relationships for the benefits of some organisms and to the detriment of others. And that might, of course, include human organisms. So what relationships should be modified and how is a question, I guess, for which science alone has no answer. The answer comes, I think, as Francisca Lima told us today, that comes, when she was making this comparison between the positivist, I guess, project of geography versus a more situation-specific project of choreography, like the answer to the question comes from a more situation-specific and historically based understanding of ideas of meaning and how we navigate the world as humans. So, again, science might provide us with some of the basic principles, but it won't provide us with the intentions. And I think the intentions are going to come again from that specific position that the designer, that the landscape architect, that the landscape architecture student might take within these different and often contradictory forms of knowledge that are provided by science. And just, I guess, taking that position, if you like, might constitute the very first act of design. What is the first choice in a course of actions that would eventually transform what exists into something that is different from what exists, into something that is desired, I guess. And I might leave it there as well, maybe for Anita or for Francisca.
Please, maybe we start with Francisca and then Anita gets with the final comment.
Yeah. No, I just got here, so I
okay.
did not have the privilege
maybe you can speak of Bolivar, Venezuela, and Humboldt. Francisca, please.
Thank you very much. It is really nice to hear all your takes on the discussion. I have maybe some comments on what Pablo and Günther have mentioned. One thing, and also actually Rita, one thing is that, for example, like in Edinburgh, we have a 2-year master that accepts non-designers. And so we have these two populations that are very different. And sometimes very often actually the non-designers also, they thrive, they actually very quickly adapt or develop the skills of designers, which is quite amazing to actually see. Of course, I also think that this happens when you have a mixed environment of students where non-designers and designers are in communication and in peer comparison, and therefore there is this observation that happens and that makes students develop their skills quite quickly. On another note, also to say that of course, I was going to say that I also come, so although I'm now teaching in a university or in a school of art, I was trained as a landscape architect in an agronomy school. So I also, in a way, I'm very familiarized and very keen also in this training of how ecology, the nature of soils, the different species of vegetation, how they actually have a bearing in the ways that cities are developed and also the way that we design. And I think that, again, good designers will end up navigating all these fields again. And that I think touches what Pablo was saying of actually navigating the world through different techniques, or we know, like from bottom up to top down, and mechanisms and also generalizations and detailed observations can all be in parallel. And I think that's an important thing to take from Humboldt, definitely. And I think I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisca. Anita, do you wish to say something?
So, well, about Humboldt and Latin America, you know, I will just be brief. You know, in relationship to Franco Farinelli's description of Humboldt and his complex situation, I would say that is a fascinating topic, and it's certainly fascinating vis-a-vis his travels in Latin America, because of course he needed a salvoconducto, you know, a permission, right, from the King of Spain to just go there, and it's like what we call now a passport, basically. But of course, in exchange, he was providing information about mines and all kinds of things. That's fine. And at the same time, he has this fantastic agenda. And I am fascinated by the kinds of depictions of landscapes that were produced out of that trip. I am also fascinated by how Humboldt was networked into what was already an existing network of scientists in America, and about that collaboration. And so, and I am also fascinated by the production of knowledge itself, the kinds of resources and investments that he had that enabled him to then take all of that knowledge and produce it. And we know how expensive those books were, who could afford them, who couldn't afford them, in the sense that even the aristocracy wasn't. And we heard yesterday how much investment he had to put into that. So that moment seems so, and his commitment to it, and his passion and his commitment to the political project are extremely inspiring. But I am also, and that is of course why he was speaking to Bolivar, but also Jefferson and the others. You know, I just spent 3 hours with so our admitted students, and landscape architecture demands such an extraordinary mental agility. You know, for instance, I am looking outside of my window right now, and I see a bench, right? And so any student and any historian or practicing landscape architect, you know, what's in a bench? In a bench is the comfort of a human body. And we teach them how to design for that. But also it's about the materials and where they come from. And if it's wood, where did the wood come from? And how did it get here? And immediately it's placed in a kind of global economy and a supply chain, right? And then in between is who is sitting on the bench and how do they get there, and what neighborhood is it, and what street, and is it, and who has literally the possibility and when in their daytime and in their life. And so we have to continuously zoom in and zoom out and zoom in and zoom out and go, you know, from deep time, geologically speaking, to the ephemerality of the tree that's casting its shade on the bench, and from the forms of labor that went to producing that to global supply chains. And that agility that is embedded as a kind of DNA in even the smallest possible landscape, as a material and physical condition, is what I see in Humboldt, you know, when he is looking at the world and also zooming in and looking at a particular plant and analyzing, or writing about what he is seeing. Or, you know, in one of the, I was just recently reading the views from the Cordilleras, and how he's actually nostalgic about the stones that he sees near his home, and how they appear in the sites that he is traveling in South America. And the questioning of, you know, what is the connection between that geology and this geology, and the processes that are the same, and at the same time thinking about what makes them completely different. So I think, you know, that this is why we made the point of Pablo and I of this kind of model, this model of a kind of intellectual agility that is required of our field in the future, to address all of the kinds of challenges that we need to address as we move on.
Well, thank you very much for, and the bench is also contemplation and view, and thank you very much.
And respite, and yes.
Yes. So we lasted the whole afternoon. I would like to give just 3 minutes if there is any question, and then 3 minutes to, I think, Veronica, are you going to announce? Okay. So if there is short questions, let's say 5 minutes more of discussion from somebody from the public or the people who have had the patience of listening to us all the afternoon? Daniele, Stefano, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, thank you to all participants, because it was extremely interesting and to follow all these topics. And in particular, I have a question for Sonia, and it's a curiosity that I thought seeing your presentation. Probably can be obvious for someone or strange for others, I don't know. But how much for you ecology is like a romantic issue, and like was born under a romantic vision of nature or not? And are they so distant as can appear, and as science from one side and art from the other side? Because in that first plan that you show in your presentation, it was like a real fusion between ecological and romanticism aesthetic in just one park. And so two things apparently very different, but was like unified in this plan design. So what is for you the cultural subtle relationship that there is between romanticism and ecology? Thank you.
Okay, so that's a great question, because it's really you're hitting the nail on the head. Because in that, so I'm going to first kind of answer in terms of the history, because at this moment in time, that's exactly what happens. So the landscape designers, Gustav Meyer probably beginning, but especially then the landscape designers who followed, so in the late 19th century and early 20th century, that's when ecology developed as a discipline, and they are beginning to use the knowledge that the early ecologists and plant geographers are producing. So they're consciously using that knowledge for the design and for the production of these romanticized landscapes. And the purpose of this being, in part at least, to produce these, these scenes, the scenery that basically was thought to bring people home, right? So that basically creates this artificial notion, this mythical notion of a homeland. So that's precisely what is happening here. Ecology is brought into the sphere of cultural production through landscape design. And if you're asking kind of me today, was that also kind of part of the question, or have I answered?
Yes, also if
okay.
There is like, so this relationship is still relevant.
Yes, I personally very strongly believe that it is very relevant, because we're human beings. And I mean, we've seen these fantastic landscapes that Günter Vogt produces. And, there needs to be kind of cultural production in a way that kind of sustains our life. So it's not only kind of the scientific knowledge that we need in order to be able to survive in this world and make this world hopefully a better place, but we also need cultural production and the arts in their manifold character.
We will do another conference maybe in 1 year or two about, real and artificial, I think, which is a great topic to face. Any other quick question? One more, just one.
Maybe I just like to address who wants to respond. Thanks a lot for all your interventions, really inspiring. I was wondering this theme of coexistence, how landscape can be like a new political agenda for, or how design actually can be the medium of coexistence, and how is the main structural point to start from. Who wants to respond? I don't know, it's really large question, but I like maybe Professor Vogt or Pablo, or who wants to reply?
Please.
Okay, maybe it's a too large question because yeah.
Too large. What do you mean with coexistence?
What's like the coexistence between living what humans and non-humans, and how design actually can really be the this medium, and about this kind of project that needs to be like really to respond of those challenges. So I think that the theme of coexistence in landscape is really important. So how you think it's the point to start for reframe actually a meaning, maybe to communities and also to people? Maybe it's not clear, I don't know, sorry.
It's a real question at the Biennale in Venice this year is how will we live together?
Exactly.
I was asked from many magazines and newspapers, and what is we have 3 exhibitions there. And I was saying, in the manner of Bruno Latour's The Parliament of Things, it's about stones, plants, animals, and us. That's the question. It's not, so it's reduced to the question how human beings are living together. For me, it's important, what about the stones, the plants, the animals, all the rest of the planet? That's the real question. And in this sense, the Biennale this year is a very good exhibition about this question: how will we live together in future? But we extend it, the we, to the not human world. I mean, this is important. No? And when we are talking about ecology, and I mean, in Switzerland and Germany, the green parties are taking over from the conservative or left-hand wing parties. Do you have a green party in Italy? Really substantial?
Yeah, we have it.
But in Germany, can you imagine, they are taking over the power. And that's the last 35 years. I couldn't imagine when I was a student in those days that this would really become relevant. And it's becoming relevant. I think this coexistence is becoming more and more relevant, especially for your generation. And I think ecology is we discussed before about ecology and what does it mean today. We shouldn't overestimate ecology. Ecology is just describing what's going on. If you would have a big lake on the earth, like it was some 100 million years ago, with more or less sulfur, and so only a bacteria surviving sulfur would survive, and ecology would just describe what happens, nothing else. Ecology is not saying it's good or bad. It's just describing what happens or make it easier. What are the consequences? If you draw as a landscape architect a land, what are the consequences? This is the question. And of course, ecology is helping you. And then we have to think about this coexistence. And biodiversity, I can tell you, many people don't really understand how important biodiversity is. And it's very difficult to explain, like ecology. It's just ecology saying it's good or bad. You can say, forget ecology, you are saying it's good or bad. And and biodiversity there, it's really clear. And I think these new expressions after ecology and sustainability are more interesting to explain this coexistence you are asking for. And we need this coexistence.
Yeah, it was more like the design, how it actually, this is the real challenge. It's really difficult how to represent this kind of coexistence also in the new challenge of landscape for the future. This was a little bit also the challenge of new landscape architects, and also the position of landscape architects that are not all the time in this kind of process, I think.
Yeah. Okay. But you know, one of my professors wrote a book, Design is Invisible. And what did he mean? And then he explained to us as a student, let's say you're a student. Saturday morning, you have to go to the university to finish your final whatever. Then in those days, we did it by hand. It's raining. Saturday morning, you're buying a newspaper and your cigarettes, and then you're waiting for the bus. What is more important, a well-designed bus station or how often the bus is coming?
Sonia, you have the...
It's very clear how often the bus is coming, and if it's a well-designed bus station, that's good. But it's coming afterwards. This social aspect is much more important. And again, what you're asking, how important is design? And I think like this project I showed in the Laban, their design is invisible. It's our most ecological design, but it looks extremely artificial. But you have to know what you see. That's important. And it's not so easy to understand sometimes what does it mean? How important is design? For me, design is important, but it shouldn't be in the forefront. It can be, sometimes it can really be invisible. And these ecological aspects are not visible directly.
We can, Sonia, you want to speak? We can now show to the students together Boeri's Grattacielo and your design and ask the student which is the most sustainable.
No, I just wanted to add that in a lot of studios that we teach at UPenn, biodiversity is really at the forefront, and there's recently been a competition. And Fabio mentioned already my colleague Richard Beller's Atlas for the End of the World, which is all about biodiversity. But then there's also been a kind of fun competition where people were asked to design for a particular animal species of their choice. So, you know, all these things are exercises, of course, to draw attention to issues of diversity.
You mean communication, in the sense of communication?
In the sense of communication, yes, but also design. So you're designing spaces, you're designing environments that are principally, let's say, for an ant or a particular species of mouse. So obviously that kind of makes people think about ecology, about relationships between species, between the abiotic environment and the biotic environment and so forth. So that's a particular kind of design exercise that in this case was carried out actually through a very exuberant competition and with many competition entries. And some very good examples, so you can look at them on the website if anybody's interested. But
thank you, Sonia. Paolo, you wanted to say something. I saw your microphone.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, just very quickly. I guess, and actually with the examples that Sonia presented today, I think also is the educational component of landscape design. You know, like when sometimes it is about making designs that might have real implications depending on the scale for the development of certain forms of biodiversity to actually happen, and in some other cases might be about more smaller interventions that happen within urban environments that might raise awareness about the importance. So, you know, where to set up a limit, how to design the interface between the space that is primarily human or social space and spaces that might, in which some other processes might be taking place, you know, and how to define the spaces in which some kind of processes take place or the others, and how to design the interface between those two different kinds of spaces. I think the educational component, what is the role of landscape architecture in raising awareness about some of those topics is also important, even if the scale of the intervention might not have real physical or material consequences in itself.
Okay, thank you. I think I want to just give 2 minutes the floor to Veronica, that is announcing a call that the PhD students, and as you know, we are going to make a book after this today's conference. So we will ask you to all the lecturers to prepare a text, but also there will be a call launched. Veronica, please, to you.
Yeah, maybe I can, let's say, share very quickly. Just, I don't know if you see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I would like just to thank you, everybody, and saying that I think that all of us, as a PhD student today, we'll come back home, or I mean, we are at home, but we'll go to sleep, let's say, with a huge and massive amount of question and really amazing reflection inspired by your intervention. And that's why we decided even to, let's say, broaden and enlarge, if we have already super wide border, about this topic, about this, let's say, dichotomal relationship between art and science. And so our basic idea is to open the call even outside the academic work, trying to, let's say, tackle the relation between artists, photographers, historians, of course, designers, into an understanding through project essays, photographs essays, or even interviews, this, let's say, quite promising relation between art and science. So next Friday, we will officially launch the call. And for all of you, I mean, not you as contributor, as guest, you will be, of course, outside the call. Want to participate, the first deadline would be in the end of May. And so
we can say to all the professors, if they want to publicize the call in the schools, and maybe try to create a network also, not only at the level of professors, but also at the level of scholars, PhD students, younger students, or whatever. So you have another slide, Veronica, or that's all?
Oh, just this one.
Okay.
One.
Okay. So let me really thank you for your presence, for your interesting insights. I think we all have learned a lot from each other, and it has been very interesting. And we hope to keep in touch and to establish even more profound networks in the future, and hopefully to see each other really and not virtually only. Thank you.